The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 651, The Trajectory of History. How is this going? This time Sir Franklin was even more excited than the young officer and grabbed the other man's collar. Sir, please listen to my explanation. It is normal for 1 or 2 out of 8,000 cans to be damaged. The custodian is still quibbling, but there is no can in the world that smells bad less than a month after delivery, unless the beef itself is bad. Point afterwards, the expedition team members opened other cans and found that almost all of them in this box were bad, and the canned fruit on the side was even more outrageous. Not only had they not been peeled, they even had the corpses of insects inside. Then these people who were about to risk their lives on an Arctic expedition expressed strong dissatisfaction with the warehouse keeper and his colleagues when Royal Navy guards arrived. The warehouse keeper had been beaten into a pig's head. Later, after interrogation, it was revealed that the salesperson of the cannery bribed the custodian and passed off the goods as inferior goods. Naturally, Sir Franklin could no longer trust Duquette and his London canneries, so Alina finally got the deal, but she couldn't help but feel worried. After all, Sir Franklin was already 59 years old at this time, but the latter responded to the former with the humor unique to British gentlemen. Miss, I'm not yet 60 years old. Wish me good luck. If we return safely, we will never forget the help you and your cans have provided to us. However, just 2 months after Sir Franklin's voyage, his expedition lost contact with London. There are many different opinions on the reasons for Sir Franklin's failure in history, but it is certain that most of them died of lead poisoning and scurvy. There are also many theories as to why the crew would rather eat their compatriots than canned food in the cabin. One group believed that many of the cans were broken before being sent to the ship and were inedible, so the crew chose to find food on their own. Since Austria has developed canning compression technology, these 8,000 cans can still make some small money. After all, in this era, the mainstream relies on manual canning and sealing, and the cost will be several to dozens of times higher. However, this level of funds is almost invisible in Franz's account. But having said that, there are really not many people who buy cans in peacetime, so it cannot be said that it is a worthless thing. Of course, whether the cans of the Austrian Empire can become an instant hit in the UK depends on whether Sir Franklin and his expedition team can come back alive. After all, they are the best billboards. In fact, Austrian cans have a price advantage, but they cannot withstand the high tariffs charged by the British, which greatly offsets their competitiveness. After that, Alina got a new task, which was to sell the cans of the Austrian Empire to the world. Although it sounds very high level, he is actually a high level salesman. However, this kind of words was still very useful to the ears of 19th century people. She felt that she was taken seriously and started to work harder. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Some news from the other side of the world made Franz very depressed. The Americans were buying piglets from the Qing dynasty and planned to build the Pacific Railway. The Americans finally found their way to the Pacific through the cracks, and they are working hard for their destiny. However, this also meant that the United States mobilization capabilities would increase in the future, and war with the California colonies would be inevitable. After all, there are British people in the north of Oregon, Russians in the northwest, and Austrian colonies across the mountains. If the Americans want to gain a foothold, they cannot do nothing, and their biggest enemy is Austria. This is mainly because the numbers of Russians and British are too small. The total number of colonists from the two countries probably does not exceed 2,000. In Austria's California, there are hundreds of thousands of Germans alone, not to mention the local indigenous and imported Central American populations, as well as the rapidly increasing number of Japanese workers. In fact, Franz used Japanese laborers instead of Qing laborers. The main reason is that the latter's combat effectiveness is too strong. Although the Japanese also have a tradition of subjugating superiors, it only exists among the samurai class. On the other hand, since the uprising of Chen Sheng and Wu Guang in the Qin dynasty, the idea that princes, generals, and ministers would rather have their own kind has been deeply rooted in the hearts of the people. Let's not talk about the clan and party issues in the South. Let's just talk about the northerners who everyone thinks are weaker and more docile. The latter undertook almost all the large-scale uprisings in the early and mid-Qing dynasty, including the Pushao uprising of the Liao Guanhe sect, the Wanglun uprising of the Qingshu sect, the Li Wencheng and Lin Qing uprisings of the Xianli sect, and the Sichuan Chu White Lotus sect uprising. Even during the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, there were 9 troops in the north, as well as the Wengxin Rebellion and the White Lotus Rebellion in northwest Shandong. The subsequent Boxer Rebellion caused great chaos in the world, as a famous invader of later generations would describe it. The Chinese people have infinite vitality. No country in Europe, America, or Japan has the brain power and military power to rule a quarter of the world's living beings. The enemy's evaluation is often extremely pertinent. France has no doubt about this. When someone mentions a fighting nation, they always think of Russia, and when someone mentions a powder keg, they always think of the Balkans. The Qing people were insensitive and easy to rule. But the reality is that according to the records of the Qing dynasties, from the Opium War to the fall of the Qing dynasty on February 12, 1912, more than 5,000 uprisings broke out. Among them, between 1856 and 1865. The most violent period, more than 2,000 uprisings broke out. Moreover, the Qing dynasty's own records are quite good, and there is almost no possibility of adding exaggeration or falsification. In the 24 years, known as the most turbulent in Japanese history, from the arrival of the Black Ships in 1853 to the end of the Southwest War on September 24, 1877. There were less than 50 large-scale civil unrests in comparison. Are the Chinese people's fighting spirit much stronger? Therefore, if Franz wants to save his life, it is best not to touch the Chinese workers. After all, Austria itself is also a powder keg. Franz was fighting a civil war here, and he couldn't stand it when he suddenly said, princes, generals, and ministers would rather have their own kind in the backyard. At the same time, the Japanese are relatively easy to rule and assimilate in terms of tradition, thinking mode, and national character. To put it simply, at that time, Japanese civilians did not even have names. And the stickiness of village communities was not strong. Mainly due to Japan's mountainous and island environment, coupled with its location in a volcanic and earthquake zone, as well as the blessing of typhoons, tsunamis and other natural disasters. Human life is not guaranteed at all, so they have no guarantee for the inheritance of blood. Not too much attachment. On the contrary, these people are both indifferent and fanatical. They are extremely cruel to the weak and extremely flattering to the strong. In ancient Japan, society was not based on bloodlines, but was divided by region and class. This resulted in Japanese people being model students wherever they went, because these people would spare no effort to integrate into the local society. Like the Japanese who fought for the US military in World War II, they even sacrificed the lives of their compatriots in exchange for military glory. As for the spirit of enduring hardship and standing hard work, this is common to East Asian nations. Although Franz hates Koreans, those people can really endure hardship. Even those Korean entertainment stars who are often ridiculed may have very distorted personalities, but their serious and hard-working attitude is worthy of recognition. Chapter 652 Hugo is coming. As soon as Hugo left the rescue station, he saw Hilferstrasse, one of the busiest streets in Vienna at that time. The endless bustling streets on both sides made it difficult for Hugo to imagine that this was once the dirtiest and most chaotic area in Vienna, with the worst security and infrastructure. French newspapers said that it was full of beggars and pickpockets, that gang members fought with each other every day, that half of the boys would not survive to adulthood, and half of the girls would become prostitutes before they reached adulthood. Rats will eat the dead person into white bones within a few hours, and those bones will be eaten by cockroaches within 3 days, and then the rain will completely erase the traces of human life. At this time, people were coming and going on Hilfer Street. Ornately decorated horse-drawn carriages and various strange-shaped steam locomotives were parked on both sides of the road. Franz had no intention of studying steam locomotives at this time, but Austrian technology naturally went astray. However, since there is no internal combustion engine yet, these so-called cars have a rather steampunk feel. Franz felt that these things polluted the environment, so he instituted a mechanical tobacco tax on the grounds that smoking was prohibited in Vienna. The top leaders of the Austrian Empire are always more welcoming to things that can increase tax revenue. But even with the addition of mechanical tobacco tax, Austrians' enthusiasm for developing new transportation tools has not diminished. In fact, many people have discovered the royal family's gaps in this field, so a large amount of private capital and people of insight have poured in. But Franz does not have high expectations for them. After all, the necessary front-end technology has not yet been completed. Franz has already given the design concept of the internal combustion engine. As for when the Austrian scientists can tinker with it, it depends on God's will. In addition, Franz's requirement for steam locomotives at this time was for agricultural use. After all, steam tractors, a high-power, low-speed, low-flexibility machine, were much more reliable than lightweight passenger cars during this period. As long as the fault tolerance is large enough, it can be driven even without an internal combustion engine. And after a period of research and development, gratifying progress has indeed been made, and steam tractors have also proven to be feasible and efficient. Of course, this is only suitable for large farms. In fact, this new type of machinery is too large and expensive for small farms and ordinary farmers at this time. Steam tractors often weighed more than 10 tons, or even dozens of tons. The first test vehicle built by the Royal Society of Sciences in Vienna was 13 meters long and weighed 31 tons. However, it only had a pitiful 25 horsepower and a speed of only 100,000 tons 4 kilometers per hour. Normal walking is about 5 kilometers per hour. A modern, unspectacular 50 horsepower domestic tractor usually weighs just 1 ton. However, this does not prevent it from being the most advanced agricultural machinery in mankind at this time, and Franz believes that a simplified version will appear soon. In fact, as Franz expected, a simplified version with 50 horsepower soon appeared, and then a special version with twin steam engines appeared. Although it reached 80 horsepower, it was very troublesome to require 4 drivers closer to home. Hugo was curious about the strange vehicles on the street. At this time in history, only the United Kingdom and the United States paid more attention to steam vehicles, but it was difficult to see steam vehicles even on the streets of London. Hugo was not an avid technology enthusiast, so naturally he had never seen steam cars. However, his curious look made him look very much like a thief or a hillbilly. Naturally, he was driven away by the whistle and the steward holding a bell, but fortunately, the dazzling shops nearby attracted him. A variety of strange and eccentric products are displayed in the huge glass windows, including all kinds of products from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. In addition, fine wine, food, and musical instruments from all over the Austrian Empire are also gathered here, but it is the precious mechanical devices and rubber products that caught Hugo's attention the most. In Paris at this time, a pair of rubber waterproof shoes cost as much as 100 francs. Due to the extreme scarcity of rubber, only a few dignitaries could afford to wear it. The store on Hilfer Street only cost 5 florins, which really made Hugo feel a little stunned. The exaggerated number of people on the street also made him feel strange. After all, he heard that Vienna's population was only about 400,000, and Hugo felt that the street was more crowded than Paris, which has a population of 1 million. In fact, since Vienna joined the German Zollverein in 1836, its permanent population has doubled. In addition, as it is the political, economic, cultural, transportation, scientific and technological, and international exchange center of the Austrian Empire, the floating population has become even more difficult. Hugo also noticed one thing, that is, in addition to the exquisite and luxurious old buildings on this street, there are more new and tall buildings. The buildings were so tall that Hugo even wondered if they were at risk of collapse. In fact, there were almost no reinforced concrete buildings in Paris at this time, so he had this question. Historically, Paris only began to build large-scale buildings based on reinforced concrete after 1880. At this time, it was naturally impossible for high-rise buildings to be everywhere with old masonry structures. The buildings in Vienna in the book are not very high, only 4 or 5 floors, but they are still much taller than the old buildings. What attracted Hugo most was not the tall buildings, but the huge display windows in the buildings. Large pieces of glass during this period were still very expensive. Although after 1830, thanks to the invention of molds, making large pieces of glass was no longer a secret mastered by a few people, the output was still very low due to technical constraints. Historically, Austria was still the world's largest glass producer until 1848. At its peak, Bohemia alone accounted for 1/3 of Europe's glass production. However, due to the destruction of the Great Revolution and the fact that Austrian glass manufacturers were stuck in their ways and still relied on manual production in small family workshops, they eventually fell tragically into the torrent of the industrial age. As the world's largest glass producer, only 32 years later, 1880, the combined glass output of the entire Austrian Empire was less than that of a single factory in Sunderland, England. Franz did not want this situation to happen again, so he promoted new ideas and new technologies to these people under various names several times. As a result, they were thought to be spying on their secrets of making money, and Franz had no choice but to slap them. Awake. The result was that this slap directly made Franz the largest glass manufacturer in the Austrian Empire, because this group of unlucky people were still fighting among themselves when Franz slapped him. Franz's slap carries huge capital and technological innovation. If these people join forces to form an alliance and work together, they can still compete with the former, of course. If these people can unite to regain their glory, Franz can even choose to give up the market to them for development. But before Franz slapped him, the group of people were already fighting each other to the killing line. In addition, the affairs of the Winster family at that time involved many businessmen. After all, those themselves were not clean. After Franz finished his attack, he briefly monopolized the glass industry in the Austrian Empire. Then came drastic structural reforms and technological innovation, so that Austrians could use such cheap glass at this time. As the richest city in Austria and the busiest street in Vienna, it is not surprising that the best glass is used. While Hugo was wandering around, he accidentally met a girl named Tina. The two had a good conversation, and the latter naturally took on the role of guide. In fact, any man will be wary when faced with a beautiful girl who suddenly jumps out and takes the initiative to lead the way. But who makes him a romantic Frenchman? Chapter 653, Monopolizing Oahu Island. When Friedrich's fleet returned to Hawaii, the local indigenous people began to exclude the Austrian forces under the instigation of British, French and American businessmen. Of course, they would not dare to harass the Austrians directly. After all, Friedrich's previous sweep almost broke the backbone of the indigenous people. However, they still dared to attack those Nanming workers. After all, they didn't look tough, and they had always behaved themselves when working on the island. Naturally, the persimmons had to be picked up when they were soft, so the natives bumped into the iron plate. In fact, these workers are actually Nanming's army, so the organization and combat effectiveness are completely beyond the imagination of the indigenous people. Moreover, most of them have lived on the island of Kalimantan for a long time, so they are very familiar with the terrain of the rainforest island, and they are not at all timid like the Austrians. At the same time, the Austrians on Hawaii Island are not idiots. They all know that, after dealing with the larger number of Chinese workers, they themselves will be the next ones, so they directly open warehouses and arm the Chinese workers. As for the gentle policy promised to the indigenous people, all the policies were null and void. After all, the opponent's gun was pointed at their foreheads. If they didn't fight back, they would get nothing but ridicule. Of course, those who have completed the transformation or expressed willingness to accept the transformation can work in a separate area. Those who attempted to leave or take part in the fighting against Austria were considered enemies, and no surrender was accepted. This was forced by Franz. After all, prisoners could be treated preferentially, but if once traitors were not punished, it would be both an insult to the loyal and cruel to the unfinished business. In fact, Franz's worries were unnecessary. Missionaries in this period did not have Mary's disease at all. In addition, their long-term experience in engaging in pyramid schemes in various harsh environments around the world made them extremely sensitive to danger, and there is no moral burden at all. The result was that the organized Nanming army chased and killed the indigenous people all over the mountains and plains. In the end, Kamehameha III had to invite businessmen from Britain, France, and the United States to mediate. However, due to the repeated transgressions of the indigenous people, those so-called agreements have become waste paper after all. Working in Austria means having enough food and clothing, so security becomes the most urgent requirement. Therefore, the Nanming labor force's attack on the indigenous people has not stopped, but it is no longer a blatant attack on the villages. Instead, it was changed to the law of the dark jungle. Any indigenous people who did not follow the prescribed path as required, as well as any indigenous people who may be armed, or may have malicious intentions, will be regarded as enemies. In fact, to put it simply, it is a vendetta. This is naturally not what Franz wants to see, because what he needs is a stable Pacific transit station, not a piece of white land. Fortunately, Friedrich discovered this situation when he returned to the island. After another violent beating of the local indigenous people, he officially declared the Austrian Empire's hegemony on Oahu. The Kingdom of Hawaii has a total of 8 large islands, namely Kauai, Niihau, Oahu, Molokai, Lanai, Maui, Kahului, and the Big Island of Hawaii. Except for Niihau, Kahului, and Lanai, which are not suitable for large-scale agricultural production, the other islands have very favorable natural conditions. Therefore, Princess Sanika's suggestion was to purchase land from Niihau, Kahului, and Lanai, and then exchange it with the indigenous people on Oahu. In fact, the indigenous people on Oahu don't want to live on fear. Although these 3 islands are not suitable for large-scale agricultural production, they are more than enough to be self-sufficient, and they can also operate some grazing industries. The two hit it off immediately, and soon most of the indigenous people signed a new exchange agreement. As for the indigenous people who want to stay on Oahu, they must either dedicate their land to become farmers, or they can only live on land separately divided by Austria. The forces of Britain, France, and the United States want to cause trouble, but their own forces cannot reach this place. The 2 visits of the Austrian Imperial Navy have made them realize the gap between them. Businessmen are all looking for money, and there are few who really want to fight to the death with the Austrian Empire. Moreover, at this time, Hawaii's status was far less important than that of later generations, and people did not realize the value of Pearl Harbor, an excellent military port in the middle of the Pacific. So everyone shook hands and made peace, and continued to bully the natives of Hawaii. The most ruthless among them are the Americans, because they arrived last, and are the most looked down upon by the great powers. In fact, the colonists during this period paid most attention to mineral resources, so those precious minerals had already been reserved by the British and French. Even the volcanic ash was reserved by the British and French. Therefore, the American colonist caravans could only choose to directly attack the indigenous tribes who were sitting on resources, and let the latter forcibly sign contracts with the former. The reason why the Americans dare to do this is because they have obtained the seaport of the Oregon region, and their power can radiate directly to the Pacific Ocean. Regardless of whether Britain or France sent fleets to Hawaii, it was really not worth the gain. So even if they were sent, the scale would usually be small. In the several military operations carried out by Britain and France against Hawaii in history, an average of only 1 to 2 warships participated. On the one hand, Hawaii is really weak. On the other hand, it is also a cost issue. Again, people at this time have not realized the importance of this place. Afterwards, in addition to transferring a group of people from the mainland to manage Hawaii, Franz also introduced immigrants from Japan to develop the land and dilute the population of Nanming. At the same time, the church was also asked to try its best to convert the local indigenous people into usable labor and land capitalists. If Franz wanted to effectively control the Hawaiian region for a long time, he must check and balance the local forces, and no one company could dominate. As time goes on, the influence of the church will become weaker and weaker. Before that, Franz must build a new bond to maintain control over it. On the other hand, after the Edo Bay incident, the shogunate could only completely fall to the Austrian side. Masahiro Abe even used the name of the general to build a new shrine on a mountain in Edo Castle, named Tenjiten Point. The previous flying thunder god was actually made by Kaguya's followers, which naturally made the shogunate grateful. But more importantly, she was also the Austrian minister to Japan at this time and the regional manager of the Austrian Royal Overseas Development Company. Point. Whether it was the shogunate or local lords who wanted to establish contact with the Austrian Empire, they had to go through Kaguya Point. Therefore, the Tenten shrine where she lives is also called Zayabu Point. Masahiro Abe's traitorous behavior also encountered collective opposition from businessmen, and some even planned to punish him. The result was naturally that he could only return in vain. After all, the shogunate's strength had been restored at this time, and Abe Masahiro also knew what the outcome would be if he did so. Death as a traitor is an inevitable outcome, but an ant is still greedy for life, let alone the top leader of a country. As for Tokugawa Riki, he was an incompetent and powerless general just like in history. Rather than fighting for power and watching women vying for power and jealousy, he preferred to watch cherry blossoms and drink wine. Although he is a rare general with a long life, living to be 61 years old, he has been known as mediocre, weak, stupid, and ignorant throughout his life. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 654, The Papal States. In fact, while Franz was causing trouble everywhere, Prime Minister Metternich was not idle, but he still followed the historical trajectory and slid to Italy. The four countries of Parma, Lucca, Modena, and Tuscany in central Italy are actually controlled by Austria and are only nominally independent countries, especially with the construction of railways and the establishment of the Apennine Commercial Alliance. These areas increasingly strengthened ties with the Austrian Empire have actually become part of the Austrian market. As for the most powerful kingdom of Sardinia in the entire Italian peninsula, it has also had many marriages with the Austrian Empire. It is also influenced by the latter to a certain extent, at least on the surface. It is surrendered. Ferdinand II of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies directly changed from an extreme liberal to an extreme conservative due to constant rebellions in the country and a deep fear of death. Conservative to the point of being close to the country. That's right, the king who established the first railway on the Italian peninsula, the first modern shipping company, and laid the first telegraph line. Ferdinand II even cut off foreign trade routes for fear of revolutionaries landing from the sea, which eventually led to domestic famine and the decline of commerce. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies was too far away from the Austrian mainland, and this insane way of governing was naturally not Metternich's cup of tea. He was targeting the Papal States. If Tsarist Russia was a sewer of literacy among the great powers, then the Papal States was the bottomless pit of literacy among non-great powers. Peasants, who make up the vast majority of the population, do not have the right to receive education or financial resources. The operation of the country does not depend on the government or the law, but depends on the mood of the Pope and priests at that time. Priests in the Papal States had great power. They could enter any house in the parish, similar to a community, at any time and judge whether the holy teachings of the church were observed. They are both police chiefs, judges, and prosecutors. In addition, they also hold the military and legislative power, as well as the functions of acting on behalf of the Holy See and judging heretics. In short, priests are gods in their own diocese, and the things they do may make the benevolent African kings in later generations look much wiser. More than 3 million people out of a population of 3.3 million in the entire Papal State are chronically hungry. People live a medieval life, and there is almost no public lighting at night. The poor people's houses were made of mud and stones, and their roofs were covered with straw. Even the luxurious palaces where nobles and priests lived were covered in stench, because they also had no sanitation system. Piles of filth can be seen everywhere on both sides of the road, as well as buckets hanging by second floor windows. There are quite a few people who cannot afford iron tools. Many people are not fully clothed, and some families even only have one pair of trousers. The terrible poverty is not only difficult for modern people to believe, but also for diplomats stationed in the Papal States. Rudolf von Lutzow, the Austrian ambassador to Rome, wrote in his diary, "It's Hard for me to believe that I saw the most blasphemous thing in the place closest to God. People were hungry, poorly clothed, and didn't realize it. Ridiculousness and ignorance are not enough to describe what I saw. On the way to Rome I met a very cute child who seemed very interested in my cat. Because the child had a beautiful face, beautiful eyes, and a beautiful voice, but he had no clothes on and his hair was very long, so I couldn't determine its gender as a traditional Viennese. I love children, so I gave my cat to the cute little guy, a shirt, and a silver coin, hoping that he or she would have a happy life one day. After about a quarter of an hour, I found that the child had forgotten to take the cat food. I didn't want Mr. Saswa, the cat's name, to leave his beloved dried fish, so I turned back. However, what I saw was a dirty woman wearing the white shirt I gave away, and on the wooden shelf beside me was a bloody Mr. Saswa. I angrily took out my single-shot pistol from the box and wanted to make the dirty woman in front of me pay for Mr. Saswa's life. But when I saw the grateful and expectant eyes of the two children beside me, I chose to get back on the carriage and leave as fast as I could. The poverty, backwardness, and ignorance of the Papal States can be seen when the cardinals rode through the streets in extremely luxurious carriages. Countless beggars were shuttled through the city. They beg at every street corner, in every square, at every monument, and at every church door. They are as omnipresent as the infinite power described by the church. Pope Gregory XVI was not a beloved ruler, and his incompetence and stupidity were deepening the country's crisis. Pope Gregory XVI was born into a local aristocratic family in Lombardy, northern Italy. He has a tall nose, downturned lips, and a permanent frown expression. The most terrifying thing is the tattoo on his face. The tumor forced him to live in seclusion. Pope Gregory XVI regarded himself as an ascetic, but he successively established financial institutions such as the Discount Bank, the Bank of Rome, the Holy Spirit Bank and the Savings Bank. He also established a holy water company and appointed entrepreneurs to manage the internal affairs of the church. His desire for money far exceeded that of his predecessors. However, due to poor management, the Papal State could only borrow money to survive the current crisis. By 1846, the total debt had reached 36 million sterling gold coins. One sterling gold coin equals £0.40. Among them, France's Rothschild Bank alone lent nearly 20 million francs, and the debt owed to the Austrian Empire exceeded 50 million florins. In order to repay debts, Gregory XVI mortgaged tax cards from various places, as well as the trading privileges of wine, salt, fish, cane sugar, and cotton cloth to merchants. This further exacerbates the divide between rich and poor, with the black aristocracy controlling everything, while millions of people suffer from poverty and hunger. The black nobility refers to the descendants of the Pope and relatives of cardinals. It is also said that the monks are called black nobility because they wear black clothes under such a rule. Coupled with the spread of nationalist ideas, uprisings were inevitable. At first, the Papal States did not realize the seriousness of the problem. Mastfer, then Bishop of Bologna, later Pius IX, did not evaluate the rebels as follows. The whole mob in Perugia, Foligno, Spoleto and Terni numbered no more than 500 without uniforms, no leadership, and no courage. These people have no ability to scare anyone. Then, the so-called 500 rebels defeated the Papal States' 12,000-strong army under the city of Bologna. The team quickly grew, rushed into the town, killed the clergy, and robbed the holy treasury everywhere. Mastafel abandoned the city and fled, but he did not think that he had lost, but that he suffered an epileptic seizure that prevented him from leading the expedition, which caused his morale to collapse, and he applied to the Holy See to take command again. The senior officials of the Holy See felt that he was very brave and decided to give him another chance. As a result, they suffered another disastrous defeat in the Imola region, and the 30,000-strong army of the Papal State was defeated in one blow. Gregory XVI had to send people overnight to France and Austria to mobilize reinforcement. In 1831, the July monarchy had just overthrown the rule of the Bourbon dynasty, and Louis Philippe had no time to visit, so he only sent 250 soldiers to guard the Holy See. Gregory XVI was so angry that he almost suffered a stroke. Fortunately, Rugi Lambrusciani, the Holy See's chief secretary of state, defied all odds and invited the Austrians. Both the then Emperor Franz II and Prime Minister Metternich thought this was a good opportunity point. As a result, the Austrian army entered the territory of the Papal States to quell the rebellion. The result was shocking. The rebels, which the Pope had previously claimed could only be fought by uniting Catholics from all over the world, were easily defeated by the Austrian army in Bologna. However, although the rebellion was put down, the root problem has never been solved. As time went by the time Francis II passed away in 1835, the Austrian Empire's annual military expenditures in the Papal States had reached millions. After the death of the Italian Emperor, Metternich, who had no one to support him, naturally had no choice but to cut expenses and survive in order to maintain the papal rule. However, history has changed at this time. With the Austrian Empire joining the German customs union in 1834, and the subsequent intervention of France, its economic strength far exceeded that of the same period in history. Metternich was not stupid. He knew that the times were quietly changing, and those governments that failed to make changes in time would be swept into the trash heap of history. For example, the Bourbon dynasty, which was successfully restored after the Napoleonic Wars, was unknowingly overthrown by its people. The Papal State borders Lombardy and Venetia, and is closely connected with the small states in central Italy. Its stability will directly affect Austria's rule in Italy. Metternich was determined to strengthen the rule of the Papal States, but he had also been to the Papal States and met the Pope himself, so he believed that reform was necessary. Metternich wanted to use his ideas to transform the Papal States and let capable people dominate the government, which was completely treason in the eyes of Gregory's V. As a result, a lot of money was spent, but with little effect. People became more miserable, and uprisings and riots occurred one after another. Tens of millions of florins are spent every year, but the Pope does not appreciate it, and there is even a tendency to turn to France. At this time Franz made some intervention mentioned before, but it is too long to briefly describe it here. Franz's advice to Metternich was to treat this as a transaction, because Gregory XVI was a businessman. No matter how selfless the Austrian Empire is, it still deserves it in the eyes of the other party. After all, Gregory XVI was the church, and the Austrian Empire was a Catholic state. Therefore, before sending troops, first send people to the Holy See to ask for the expenses of sending troops. This can greatly ease the relationship between the two countries. As a result, the Holy See's attitude towards the Austrian Empire changed significantly. Not only did it alienate France, it also gave the Austrian Empire two more cardinal positions. However, this approach treats the symptoms rather than the root cause. The Austrian Empire still needs a large amount of military funding every year to maintain the rule of the church. While doing so, it also became the target of public criticism. The people regarded the Austrian Empire as an accomplice of the black nobles. The people and nobles of the country felt that this kind of support was a complete waste. The great powers even accused the Austrian Empire of interfering in the internal affairs of the Papal States with the intention of being detrimental to the Pope. Italian nationalists even listed Austria as their number one enemy. Revolutionaries in other regions also listed the Austrian Empire as the number one reactionary force, and it even had a worse reputation than Russia for a time. France did not agree with things like selling troops to aid the United States, so he suggested Metternich to change from suppression to rule very early. For Ferrara and Bologna, which are relatively close to Austria, you can consider directly sending troops to garrison. The reason is to facilitate continued suppression. This proposal has indeed been approved by the papal office. In the eyes of the top leaders of the Papal State, preserving their own status and security is more important than anything else. The long-term presence of the Austrian Imperial army will not only reduce rebellions, but also save the need to go to Vienna every time to bring reinforcement. Then Austria proposed to help govern the Papal States. After all, there may still be dangerous element in these areas where rebellions occurred. Those people had massacred Holy See officials. In order to avoid this tragedy, the Austrian Empire could help govern and collect taxes. The senior leaders of the Holy See immediately expressed their support upon hearing this. On the one hand, they were indeed worried about security issues, and on the other hand, they had no reason to refuse, since they could get something for nothing. However, Gregory XVI was not a fool, but fortunately he was a negotiable leader finally, after the Austrian Empire guaranteed to donate 500,000 florins to the papal treasury every year. Gregory XVI finally agreed to hand over the regions of Ferrara and Bologna to the former for management. However, Gregory XVI firmly opposed the construction of railways on the land of the Papal States, so the Austrian railway could only be built to the border of Ferrara. Then the corrupt rule of the Austrian Empire won unanimous praise from the local people, and the Papal States' hundreds of years of educating the people were not in vain. As long as the Austrian side gives the people a little benefit, the latter will burst into tears of gratitude and fall into submission. In fact, Austrian businessmen still control most important industries, but the local people's requirement is just to have enough food. It is not difficult to do this in this era of rapid agricultural development. So comparing the two, the locals quickly came to the conclusion that the Austrian faith was more pious than the Roman faith, because the land could produce more food under the former's governance. This kind of self-brainwashing consciousness is a very excellent quality in the eyes of rulers. In order to fulfill the old emperor's long-cherished wish, Metternich was also steadily advancing the area of Austria's administrative area. However, paper cannot cover the fire. Someone noticed the Austrian Empire's intentions and informed the Holy See. Gregory XVI immediately ordered the return of Ravenna, Ancona and other places, but soon war broke out again, and he had to invite the Austrian army back. The rebellion never stopped in the following years, so much so that even a fool can see that Metternich was responsible. However, what the prime minister thought was a clever strategy at this time was actually playing with fire. Not to mention the opposition of the great powers, the top leaders of the Papal State alone could not always allow Austria to encroach on it like this. All the achievements made at this time were achieved under the money-grubbing and fatuous ruler Gregory XVI. If it were replaced by a more capable pope, Austria would definitely be hindered, and even had to move its giving up. However, what Franz didn't know was that the new pope who was about to appear on the stage could be said to have taken the word "people hate dogs" to the extreme. There are very few people in this world who can be hated by both conservatives and liberals, by poor people and rich people, and even he himself hates himself very much. Chapter 655 Franz's helplessness. Prince Metternich did not realize his mistake, and most of Franz's suggestions were selectively ignored. However, the superficial skills were still very good, and Franz even believed that the prince had accepted his suggestion. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace, Archduke. Franz, your words don't seem to be as easy to accept as you thought, Ajani said with a hint of ridicule. Franz knew that the other party would not be aimless, and it seemed that there must be a problem in some link. What do you want to say? Ajani did not continue to hide it, and spoke straight to the point. Our Prime Minister is still supporting the Orthodox Union in Switzerland, while his investment in the Papal States continues unabated. This made Franz a little surprised, because according to intelligence from many sources, the Austrian Imperial government should have indeed reduced funding in two places. Let Prince Metternich pay for it out of his own pocket? That's impossible, and he couldn't afford it. In the 19th century, only the state could mobilize funds worth tens of millions. How is that possible? I haven't heard of any recent changes in the Papal States and the Swiss Confederation. And the most important thing is, where does the money come from? Ajani. Our Prime Minister is also known as the European Prime Minister after all. He has been operating in the diplomatic field and in Austria for decades. Isn't it easy to hide the truth? As for money, of course it's your education fund and colony development funds. The new basic education was jointly undertaken by the imperial government and the church. One of Franz's purposes for doing this was to save money. Because of the church's own financial resources and obsession with education, the government could do a lot with very little money. But the disadvantage is that the church is very independent and does not rely on the state's financial support. At the same time, due to Franz's special status, the former does not dare to make too many demands, so even if the government defaulted on funds, Franz's basic education plan was still advancing steadily, and he naturally had no way of noticing. In the eyes of those bureaucrats, Franz was the emperor for some time, while Metternich was now the actual prime minister. After weighing the pros and cons, they almost all chose silence. There are people who want to speak out, but let alone those petty officials who are as big as sesame seeds and mung beans. Even local officials who want to give gifts to Franz may not have the chance. Similarly, neither the intelligence network, Vienna Chamber of Commerce and Industry, formed by Franz, which was mainly businessmen, nor the secret police organization, that paid a lot of money to hire, were unwilling to get involved in the struggle between the future emperor and the current prime minister. The reason is very simple, not seeking merit, but seeking no fault. Especially in political struggles, taking sides before the situation is clear is more dangerous than not taking sides. As for the Bavarian Mutual Aid Association controlled by Mrs. Sophie, it may be very influential among the people, but it is nothing on the table, let alone have access to this level of intelligence. The same is true for the church's intelligence network. Their first task is to monitor public sentiment, targeting civilians and nobles, as well as those enemies who may threaten the empire's rule. Their intelligence collection capabilities for foreign governments may be better than their own. The Violet Knights in Ajana's hands are completely different. Their intelligence collection direction is entirely based on Franz's needs. In addition to external affairs, they are also internal. They are an organization that is completely loyal to Franz and do not involve choosing sides. The problem: the personnel are even more diverse, including socialites, bartenders, live-in nannies, cooks, handymen, and even castrati. After years of training, these people have penetrated into all walks of life, and some have even become the Madame Pompadour of the Netherlands in the colonies of the Austrian Empire. Franz arranged multiple checks and balances in order to maintain stability and relative loyalty. Although everyone is responsible to Franz in the end, due to some balancing measures, the information between these forces is not transparent enough, and there are even some gaps. The result is that the government did not respond much to the reduction of funds, but first became suspicious of each other. At the same time, due to the rapid development of the economy and the relatively smooth construction of colonies, this contradiction has been greatly alleviated in practice. And some colonies have even been able to completely get rid of their dependence on government funds. But this is not good news. The colonies can develop independently without the support of the mother country, which is something Franz has been trying to avoid. It's just that Austria's plate is too big. Just the compilation of intelligence requires 10 secretaries, and the confidential work that requires 10 secretaries requires a total of 30 people to complete. If Franz had to do everything by himself, 24 hours a day might not be enough. Any emphasis will inevitably lead to omissions. At this time, decentralization is needed, and it is difficult for people in the 19th century to have Franz's vision and judgment. The result is an endless stream of problems and some hidden dangers that cannot be traced, creating today's situation. Tens of millions of dollars were missing, and Franz didn't notice at all. But what made Franz the most angry was Metternich's approach, which was not only submissive but also self-righteous. The latter never realized the trouble his approach might cause. In fact, what made Franz even more angry was that Ajana's intelligence showed that Prince Metternich did not increase troops or build bunkers in the areas of the Papal States that were actually controlled by Ferrara, Bologna, Ravenna, and Ancona. And there was no major construction, development of agriculture and commerce. Even if it means quietly building a railway in the Papal States, Franz can understand it. And our Prince Metternich actually used Franz's money to bribe those cardinals, those church priests, and those scum. This made Franz feel as uncomfortable as eating Xiang. He really didn't know whether it was because he knew the rules of the game too well, or because he had empiricism in his brain. But the most outrageous thing is its operation in Switzerland, which sent a large amount of materials and funds to Ticino, just like in history. As a result, the other party just issued a receipt, and the officials of the Austrian Empire went home happily. Although this Ticino state is ostensibly a member of the Orthodox Alliance, it has actually been bribed to join the Free Alliance. As a result, this money and weapons directly solved the urgent needs of the Freedom Alliance. The foundation for maintaining the Freedom Alliance under Franz's Golden Dollar Offensive was already in jeopardy. But at this time, Metternich's funding directly gave a big boost to the Free Alliance, which was on the verge of collapse. Those weapons and equipment made do for even more delighted point. You must know that due to the arms embargo agreement between Austria, France, Prussia, and Sahara, the Freedom Alliance can only rely on the British to import weapons. However, the British are not willing to do anything early, and the weapons they sell are not only expensive, but most of them are obsolete and junk goods, although they are now using products that have been eliminated by the Austrian military. They are really much better than those 18th century antiques sold by the British to the Swiss. Franz had previously thought that the war might not be fought if this continued, but as a result, Prince Metternich's wave of poverty alleviation may lead to a fight between the two groups in Switzerland. Although the Swiss Orthodox alliance is now at a huge disadvantage, they don't know it. And Franz will not let Switzerland continue to pretend to be neutral and become a villain. Chapter 656 Pius IX. As the second son of a minor nobleman who was born with epilepsy, Mast Ferretti, later Pius IX, his mother's greatest hope for him was to become a priest in the Papal States. The priest has said before that he is a key link in the political system of the Papal State, but 7 out of 10 of them are scum. The year 1792, when Mast Ferretti was born, happened to be one of the most chaotic periods in Europe. Louis XVI was guillotined, and the French Revolution reached its climax point in 1809. Napoleon swept across Italy, and the Roman seminary, where Mast Fair was located, was subsequently closed. What was even more unfortunate was that he was taken to France by the French while studying under Pius VI. Fortunately, the French soon ran into bad luck. Finally, in 1814, Napoleon abdicated, Pius VII returned to his hometown, and Mast Ferretti was able to continue his imperial studies. In fact, Mast Ferretti has no interest in studying. His time in France is like a vacation for him. After all, he does not have to go to school. Mast Ferretti never felt that his theological and cultural knowledge was of a high level. This was also the case when he was living in a foreign country. He could not even argue with the soldiers who guarded him. When he returned to his hometown, he was often dumbfounded by the questions from tourists. Speechless, Mast Ferretti's colleagues often joke, the best way to get a man out of religion is to have him listen to Brother Ferretti's sermons. In 1818, Mast Ferretti still became an honorable priest, but considering his occasional epilepsy, poor theological knowledge, and low adaptability, he could only serve under the guidance of other clergy. Celebrate Mass with assistance. Later, his poor performance in the Bologna uprising did not allow him to be hidden. Instead, he was promoted step by step due to unknown reasons. He soon became a bishop, and it was here that Mast Ferretti first displayed his talents and successfully isolated himself from the local church. No priest liked him, and no clergy admired him. However, Mast Ferretti's opposition to the local church earned him a good reputation, and his liberal remarks were even more praised. The young Italian party in Switzerland called it the conscience of Italy. But at this time, no one could have imagined that this somewhat funny little man would stir up troubles in the future and plunge the whole of Italy into war one day in November 1845. The British government made a decision that surprised the outside world. That was to give in to the Americans on the Oregon issue, and the latter also gained access to the Pacific Ocean. But why did the British choose to give in when the Austrian Empire occupied California and France occupied Texas and the surrounding vast areas? Is it because the mysterious potato epidemic on the island of Ireland has reappeared? Is the war at a stalemate because of the invasion of southern Brazil? Is it because the transaction with the Qing dynasty did not obtain satisfactory results? Because of cholera in London? No, it's because India is in chaos at this time. The South Asian subcontinent is really full of heroes. Flowers are blooming, gongs and drums are noisy, and firecrackers are blasting. The British, Sikhs, Afghans, Nepalis, various princely states, various religions, opium traders, and smugglers all rose up. Sir Henry Harding was desperate. Forget about the invasion of foreign enemies, there were still a huge number of rebels. If it weren't for the Indian Ocean Fleet, the war would have been over at this time. But even so, the intensity and destructive power of the war were far greater than previously imagined. Although Akbar Khan's people were poorly equipped, they were brave and good at fighting, and had a certain psychological advantage, because they had massacred tens of thousands of British troops. Although the Sikh Empire has declined, and its soldiers have no fighting spirit, they will have no desire to fight, but they are well equipped, and occupy advantageous terrain. But Sir Henry Harding had to win quickly if he wanted to end the turmoil quickly, and whether he was storming towns in the Sikh Empire, or going to the mountains to fight guerrillas with the Afghans, it was not something that could end quickly. The previous strategy of forming a stronghold and fighting a stupid war completely failed. What is even more frightening is that if the Afghans and Sikhs really join forces, it will be a super big trouble where 1 + 1 is greater than 2. In addition, the rebels all over the land were something Sir Henry Harding did not expect. He no longer knew how many letters he had written to the country asking for help. The troops in the Nanyang region are also not surplus and can only support 1,500 people. The Far East had to be on guard against the Qing dynasty and could only send up to 500 people to support it. Sir Henry Harding's best hope at this time was the Cape Colony's 5,000 men and the 20 ships of the West African Fleet. The participation of the Nepalese in the war was also unexpected by the British. After all, the British had defeated Nepal many times before and ceded a large amount of land. It was already a puppet state in the hands of the British. But in fact, a coup occurred within Nepal at this time, and the Prime Minister supported by the British was assassinated by the royal family. This was originally an internal power struggle, but the Prime Minister's faction was quite powerful. The royal family had no choice but to launch this war in order to stabilize the situation and divert conflicts. 6,000 Nepali soldiers, known as 100,000, launched an attack against the British who had been threatening their country. However, there are only more than 500 British troops and a battalion of Gurkhas stationed there. The so-called Gurkhas are Nepalese. The British commander immediately decided to retreat to the Patna area and wait for reinforcement because it was impossible for them alone to stop the Nepalese army. The British commander was actually very courageous, but he could not trust his Gurkha mercenaries. However, at that time, Nepal had no concept of a country, and people were divided more according to tribes. The Gurkhas who were hired by the British happened to belong to the Prime Minister's faction. These people have been working as mercenaries for generations, and they still have certain ethics. In addition, the tribal leader was killed. They and the Nepalese army that are now attacking are simply incompatible with each other. They are unwilling to leave regardless of emotion or reason. The British didn't want to deal with these lunatics and left as if they were running away after paying off this month's wages, perhaps because Great Britain's strength was really not exhausted. This mercenary group repelled the 100,000 strong army of the Kingdom of Nepal at the cost of almost total destruction. When the British reconnaissance team arrived, they found corpses inside and outside the fort. Only a small group of Gurkha mercenaries remained waving the flag of British India to greet them. In fact, Nepalese people live in mountainous areas with harsh natural environment and barren land. Coupled with their nation's martial tradition, even fights between the same ethnic groups will be so bloody. When the news reached Derry, Sir Henry Harding breathed a sigh of relief. It was the best news he had heard in recent times, but soon Sir Henry Harding received bad news. According to informants, the Sassoon family seemed to be planning to establish their own Jewish state on the Indian subcontinent. Sir Henry Harding's head was buzzing. He even felt that he should send someone to negotiate with the Sassoon family and then ask London to give them a promise to hold them back. After all, the Sassoon family was too rich. It would be disgusting if these damn opium dealers continue to provide financial assistance to those princes. But at this time, Sir Henry Harding received another good news. The Austrians in Tranquebar said that they could help him solve this trouble. As for the reward, he only needed a little land in the Kaleka area. Kaleka is now the region of Tamil Nadu. Chapter 657 Sassoon Family. The history of the Sassoon family is a classic underworld novel. A small family that was not popular in West Asia was expelled by powerful local forces. As a result, he took root in the Far East and became the little emperor of Bombay that everyone respected. After that, people will kill people and Buddhas will kill Buddhas. Even if a country blocks his way of making money, he can still use his connections in London to launch a war to teach people how to behave, using poison to enter the Tao. Through the huge wealth brought by the opium trade, coupled with the interpersonal relationships they have developed over the years, they have a more ambitious goal of controlling the financial market in the Far East. HSBC. This name has accompanied the entire modern history of humiliation of the ancient Eastern country. With its unique position, the Sassoon family has made HSBC the Swiss Bank of East Asia. The first choice of the officials and gentry of the Qing dynasty. After all, HSBC was a bank owned by foreigners and had a strict confidentiality system. The corrupt Qing government was unable to supervise it, let alone detect corruption. In this way, the Sassoon family was allowed to lie on the land of China sucking blood, harvesting the officials and gentry capitalists who sucked the blood of the people at the bottom, and to a certain extent, controlled the political and economic circles of the Qing dynasty. In the following nearly 100 years, bureaucrats, warlords, capitalists, landlords, and even bandits all over China were sucked by this cancer. What's even more funny is that this family actually came clean and even started selling antidote pills. Opium dealers sold antidote pills, and later generations erected monuments and wrote articles to inscribe their achievements. I have to say that Shuangwen was nothing more than that point, but now they have encountered a little trouble. Due to the recent unrest in India, the Sassoon family purchased some weapons and hired some people to act as guards. However, in the eyes of those who are interested, this is completely a posture of competing for the world. So a group of opium traffickers gathered together to persuade them to go further and establish a Jewish state to protect free trade on the South Asian subcontinent. Naturally, the people who instigated him were not all idiots. In fact, these people had their own considerations. If a Jewish state can be created to protect free trade, then they can be protected from exploitation by the British and those princes. If the Sassoon family failed, they could take their place and become the new overlords of the opium industry. In short, these flatterers can't suffer any loss. Even if nothing happens, they can still look familiar in front of Master Sassoon, right? Why not do it? This plan sounds very tempting. But David Sassoon is not a fool, so it is naturally impossible for him to believe the nonsense of this group of people. However, the speaker has no intention, but the listener has intention. This news sounded completely different to Austrian and British intelligence officers. Austrian intelligence agents quickly reported it to the Bombay headquarters, which found the plan written by Franz. In fact, what the former did not know was that the person spreading the Jewish state everywhere and persuading David Sassoon to become independent was sent by Franz. They were just waiting for a suitable opportunity. Under the chaos, the British had no time to distinguish the authenticity of the intelligence. At this moment, Sir Henry Harding could only adopt an attitude of erring on the side of rebellion. After all, if done improperly, Britain's nearly century-old operation in India might be ruined. The innocence of an opium dealer was of no consequence to the interests of the British Empire. Sir Henry Harding ordered the British military police in Bombay to go out overnight and conduct a comprehensive attack on all the Sassoon family's casinos, brothels, opium dens, banks, and trading houses. As a result, David Sassoon actually got the news before the British officials in Bombay. In fact, David Sassoon didn't even speak English, but he was so angry that he said fuck 5 times in a row. As a Jew, David Sassoon was self-aware and hoped to escape to the Qing dynasty and make a comeback. However, his son, the famous second-generation poisoner Victor Sassoon, was not willing to accept it. He is the eldest son of David Sassoon's second wife. He is usually arrogant, and he does not look down upon even the British. The identity of Victor Sassoon has been magically changed in the book. Father, people in this city call you emperor. Now that the mob wants to expel you, are you going to leave like this? No. 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 You are so kind. I will bring someone to make you a real emperor now. Victor Sassoon raised a group of Anglo-Indian mixed-race children. These guys were in a very embarrassing position in the Indian society at that time. They were discriminated against by Indians and ostracized by British colonists. Neither regards them as the same kind, so these people desperately want to prove themselves but without the opportunity, they naturally become the most unstable group of people in society. Victor Sassoon took a fancy to this and made them his most loyal and capable thugs, coupled with the fact that the Sassoon family had hired a large number of thugs to protect their property. The Mumbai gendarmerie was suddenly defeated. This situation made David Sassoon excited. Maybe he was really the son of destiny. Then he not only wanted India, he also wanted to fight back to Baghdad and skin and cramp the people there. But how could the British dominate the 19th century and be overthrown by a group of opium dealers and angry youths? The British military police were beaten back and forth. In desperation, local officials found the Indian Ocean Fleet docked on the shore for help. You can go ashore to catch thieves, but these sailors have one condition, that is, they must be allowed to rob and rape. The local officials knew the virtues of these sailors, but Bombay must not be lost. Colonel James Moore, as Bombay's supreme military governor, acquiesced to the proposal. I have to say that the British sailors were very efficient in their work. They directly bombarded the menacing rebels with solid ammunition. After the artillery attack ended, the men of the Sassoon family were directly crushed to the melodious march of the grenadiers. Fortunately, the British's discipline did not last long. After winning the frontal battle, the sailors ran towards the people. Taking advantage of this chaotic opportunity, the Sassoon family was able to escape. Their only hope at this time was Calicut in southern India, where the king was a very crazy person and wanted to fight with the Sassoon family because of the opium problem. As long as they get the protection of the Tawang, they may reach the Far East smoothly. In such a chaotic situation, it was unlikely that the British would send an army specifically to deal with them. David Sassoon now began to blame his younger son. "You are so impulsive. Can you defeat the British just by relying on your rabble? It's just a dream, Victor." Sassoon looked disdainful. "If it weren't for those naval bastards, Mumbai would be ours now." "You, David." Sassoon's later wife interrupted her husband. "Okay. Meaning my master or my lover, he is still a child. It is already a blessing that we can escape now. Don't ask for more. In fact, I have long felt that those British people are jealous of us. HMPH. David Sassoon snorted. Since he had been chased so many times, he didn't feel nervous at all. "Don't worry. When the King dynasty arrives, we will still be the masters. Their emperor will love our plan to death," David Sassoon said with great confidence. Chapter 658, setting up a stage to sing. The reason why David Sassoon was so calm on the way to escape was because his wealth had already been transferred to the Far East, and he was naturally confident. As for the properties in Bombay, he believed that they could be recovered sooner or later. After all, what did it have to do with the Anglo-Indian mixed-race people who rebelled, and the Sassoon family? Even worse, with the support of the governor of Hong Kong, John Francis Davis, the Sassoon family will definitely be protected. When the time comes, it will be easy to use the connections in London for a fool like Henry Harding to overturn the situation. Poor John Francis Davis is known as the most disliked governor in history. In fact, Pottinger left a mess to his successors. When Davis took over, the Hong Kong Island area was almost a lawless land, dirty, violent, and without any order at all. There is no household registration, high mobility of people, and the customs is ineffective. Some people land on the island to commit murders and then leave in a swagger. When the British patrol discovers them, there is nothing they can do. However, these usually do not threaten the interests of senior British officials. After all, most of them live in big houses and are protected by bodyguards. The biggest problem Davis faced was the most common problem in the colonies, being unable to make ends meet, which required a large amount of investment from the British government every year. However, according to British estimates, although the construction and maintenance costs of Hong Kong Island are huge, theoretically speaking, the income should be higher. It should at least reach the level of Austrian East Africa or Austrian Chinla. However, the reality is that Siang Island at this time is only 1/10 of the former and several dozen of the latter. Even a fool can see this problem, so Pudingcha was dismissed. What Davis had to do was to allow Siang Island itself to pay for the construction and maintenance of its garrison. Coupled with the King Pirate incident in the book, Siang Dao at this time is facing greater pressure than in history. Davis, who had just arrived in the Far East, naturally needed a local contact, and the Sassoon family had already received the news in advance from London. Elias Sassoon, the second son of David Sassoon, has become a guest of Davis. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the Sassoon family has penetrated into all walks of life and the viceroyalty point. If Davis wants peace in the Far East, he cannot do anything to his family, and Henry Harding's actions must not have been authorized by London. Otherwise David Sassoon would not dare to be so confident. As soon as the Sassoon family arrived in Calaca, they were warmly welcomed by the local king Kiran Wasage. Although the latter did not directly participate in the rebellion against the British, he took the opportunity to launch an attack on the surrounding princely states, which to a certain extent also made the Sassoon family. The situation is even more chaotic. This move is not to capture the city, but simply to rob and destroy. In order to show his power, Kiran Vasaj displayed his trophies on both sides of the roads for the Sassoon family to see. The ultimate goal is to get the Sassoon family to buy more opium from Calaca, so that he can buy more weapons from Verowise's Chamber of Commerce and become the king of Tamil Nadu. But at this time, David Sassoon didn't want to talk nonsense with him. The former just wants to leave India, a place of right and wrong, quickly. After all, if the latter discovers the former's predicament, it is very likely that he will make trouble. The two sides hesitated for a while, and then they started talking about business, probably because they both felt sick. There are more than 200 people in the Sassoon family who need at least 3 boats. In addition, the war is chaotic. Kiran Vasaj needs to send people to take care of the restless people along the way, otherwise it will be bad to disturb the wife, young lady and the like. David Sassoon and Victor Sassoon knew very well that the other party was raising prices on the ground. If it were normal times, as the largest evil force in the Far East, they would have to teach each other the rules. But now they not only have to pay, they have to pay more, and they have to pretend like nothing happened. There were many currencies in India at that time, but the most valuable one recognized by all parties was the pound sterling. 50,000 pounds. Give us another 700 boxes of opium, and send them to the main island of Nicobar. No. The goods. Kiran Wasaj was very satisfied that he was able to negotiate this big deal, while David Sassoon breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed that this trip should be a success, and he could still make money in the Far East smoothly. Recover previous losses. However, Franz does not intend to let this underworld legend continue. In fact, every move of the Sassoon family is under Franz's surveillance. The reason why they went to the Calaca area to meet with Kiran Vasaj, the opium cultivation tycoon, was all within Franz's plan. After all, Austria still needs a reason to defraud some land from the British colonial government of India. At the same time, the destruction of the Sassoon family should not be punished by lynching. Franz has chosen a suitable stage for them. Now that the actors are in place, the show is about to begin. In fact, Franz has been studying the Sassoon family's plan for a long time. From the day Vienna started drug prohibition, the previous plot, he has been looking for the source of the drug. However, the reason why it took so many years to take action was that firstly, it was too far away and beyond reach, and secondly, there was no reasonable reason. After all, David Sassoon's nickname of the Little Emperor of Bombay was not for nothing. Franz could not kill a person like a dog. Another important reason is the ineffective intelligence work. For a long time, Franz handed over the intelligence work in the Indian region to Verawise. After all, Verawise is an Indian and a local snake. In theory, this kind of intelligence collection work is not easy to do. What surprised Franz was that Verawise's men had been investigating for several years and spent countless resources, and the conclusion is, the Sassoon family are good people. They are philanthropists, peace-loving legal businessmen. They like to help the people in the Far East who were tricked by witch doctors and traveled thousands of miles to bring them the gospel of India. The beating Verawise received was not in vain. If it were the person who wrote the information who came to Vienna, Franz would definitely not be able to beat him to death. Afterwards, Franz asked Archbishop Prussia to find a group of fanatical anti-smoking activists among the parishioners. These guys were like the environmental terrorists of later generations. With the blessing of religious fanaticism, they had no fear and were omnipresent. Use every possible means. The effect was also immediate. They quickly collected a large amount of incriminating evidence about the Sassoon family, during which this group of people consolidated their beliefs. Now, even if Franz or the Archbishop said that the Sassoon family was good people, they would not believe it. Driven by this strong subjective initiative, the Sassoon family stepped into the stage preset by Franz Tranquilla, regime up, the leader of the anti-narcotics of the Estates organization, immediately decided to attack Boon, the capital and port city of Calaca, after obtaining the permission of the governor of British India and the exact movements of the Sassoon family. Power attacks. Chapter 659. Falling into a trap. Boonpul Port was a port built by France, which was once the largest colonial empire in the world. At that time, the French built a large number of permanent fortifications on it, in order to rule Calaca forever, and even had rapid-fire forts specially designed to deal with clipperzites. Just that these antiques from more than 200 years ago are now vulnerable to the attacks of the Austrian Tranquilla colonial army and the anti-narcotics war group. The guard that Kiran Vasj was so proud of was in a state of collapse. The 500 cavalrymen who were the trump card were now in full force, but they were heading in the opposite direction to the battlefield. Damn. What's going on, Kiran? Vasj also saw smoke coming from the direction of the port, but he didn't understand what happened. After all, it was surrounded by some small kingdoms, and the British had already gone inland to suppress the rebellion. Now, theoretically speaking, only Calaca Bang is responsible for beating others, and the surrounding small kingdoms should burn high incense if they are not beaten. However, Kiran Vasj saw fleeing soldiers and panicked civilians everywhere. He grabbed a deserter angrily and asked, "What happened?" At this time, Kiran Vasj's good mood that he had just negotiated a big deal was gone, and was replaced by rage. He wanted to tear the intruder into pieces immediately and drink it. In fact, Kiran Vasj did this before, but the last time was the day he usurped the throne. The Kshatriya Brahmins are coming, the soldiers said in a panic. Kiran Vasj pulled out a machete and chopped it hard on the deserter's head, then raised his head high. This is the fate of those who run away. I, Kiran Vasj, a descendant of the great Mokha Vasj, will now lead you to retake our capital city of Boonpul. Brahma is watching us. Calaca will win. The soldiers accompanying Kiran Vasj also pulled out their knives and raised their guns to stop their retreat. It has to be said that he is indeed a warlord who came to power through a coup. He does have two brushes, and he soon gathered nearly 5,000 people around him. In fact, Kiran Vasj is not a reckless man who only shouts slogans. He made his decision after careful analysis. The only white force nearby is the Danes in Tranquilla. There are only 500 to 600 troops stationed there at most, and it is not a problem for Calaca to give Kiran Vasj a period of time to produce 30,000 to 50,000 troops. He had already recruited nearly 20,000 troops during his previous campaigns in the east and west, and there were more than 6,000 troops near Boonpul alone. Although they were defeated by the opponent in a sneak attack at this time, these remnants plus their own main force, how can they still lose if they fight 1 out of 10? Kiran Vasj doesn't believe it. As a result, when Calaca's army entered Boonpul, they found that the opponent had at least 3,000 men, and in addition there were a large number of artillery. In fact, in the Indian subcontinent, more than 10 cannons are considered a lot, and the average state only has a few cannons. Facing the Calaca army that collided head-on with them, the Tranquilla colonial army was at a loss for a moment. After all, this was their first time fighting the Indian army, and according to the Danes, the Indians would only run away and surrender. Although the military organization of the church on the other side has been involved in Southeast Asia for many years, it behaves more confused than its comrades in the colonial army, because they are used to chasing and beating the natives. Even the kingdom's troops were difficult to organize once they were defeated. This was the first time they were attacked and counterattacked. Fortunately, Kiran Vasj's army was just like that, and a few rounds of shotgun stopped their charging momentum. At the same time, the Calaca army, which mainly uses cold weapons, is vulnerable to modern rifles. If they charge too hard, they will naturally suffer heavy casualties in just a quarter of an hour. Kiran Vasj lost a fifth of his army. At this time, the Austrian army also regained their composure, and they began to kill step by step. There was no suspense in the battle, and the morale of the Calaca army was about to collapse. At this time, those Kaleka officers who had been fighting on the front line discovered a problem. Their king was missing. In fact, during the first firefight, Kiran Vast found that the situation was different from what he expected, and he immediately decided to escape with his cronies. Kiran Vast did not think this was a shameful act. On the contrary, he felt that Kaleka was so big that he could make a comeback, even if the capital was lost. After all, the opponent only has a few thousand people, but Kaleka has a population of millions. I don't believe that the opponent can defeat it with 100,000 soldiers. This idea is not illogical. First of all, India is the country with the largest population after the King dynasty. Any small state has millions of people. Large states even have tens of millions of people, which is the lowest level in Europe, and is Prussia. At this time, Prussia's population was only a pitiful 17 million, and Austria was plundered by France. Coupled with medical advancements, maternal mortality and neonatal mortality had reached record lows at the same time. The rejuvenated empire also gave people hope. They could have enough to eat and have some savings. In an era when civilians did not have much entertainment, making babies became a common entertainment project. Due to the influence of religion, it is the obligation of every believer to have children. In fact, most of the ancient religions have such scriptures and obligations. After all, human resources were very important in ancient times. If there were not enough people, there would be no inheritance at all. Then Franz specifically asked the priests to preach more doctrines in this area during sermons and masses. For the lower class people in Europe at that time, they may not know the emperor or the mayor, but they must know the priests of their own diocese. In addition, Austria passed an anti-human smuggling agreement at the German Confederation Congress, intercepting a large number of people who were supposed to go to the United States and Britain. However, the price is that the number of Italians in Austria has exceeded the 10 million mark and is still increasing rapidly. You must know that the population of the Austrian Empire at this time is only 46 million. 38 million at the same time in history. The German population is about 12 million, and the total population of the German region, except the Austrian Empire, is 35 million. The only good thing is that the number of Hungarians is still around 6.5 million, and there is even a slight downward trend. After all, as the external market shrinks, the excess labor force becomes worthless. The heavy tariffs between Hungary and Austria have caused a sharp decline in trade volume between the two parties, which is mainly reflected in Austria's imported agricultural products. Population of other major countries in the world. Only counting the local area, France has 35 million, the UK has 27 million, Spain has 13 million, and the United States has 21 million. Due to constant wars, civil wars, foreign wars, and land loss, Mexico's population is smaller than at the same time in history, only 5.5 million. Ottoman 33 million, Brazil 6.6 million, Argentina 1.8 million, Persia 13 million, Serbia 950,000. Denmark 1.5 million, Portugal 3.7 million, Sweden 3.4 million, Egypt 5.3 million, Afghanistan 2.5 million, and the Sikh Empire 12 million. Due to the acquisition of Limburg and West Luxembourg, Luxembourg's land area tripled and its population increased 1.5 times to 470,000. Regarding the population of Russia, there are estimates ranging from 67 million to 83 million. The average here is 75 million. Chapter 660 Sea of Flowers. With the population of Kaleka, it is theoretically feasible to detonate 100,000 troops, but given the organization level of the Indian State Army at that time, these soldiers may not be able to be commanded in a unified manner, and the theory is just a theory after all. The reality is that the troops staying behind will not cause much trouble to the Austrian army. Black and gold flags, accompanied by the melodious army march, the neat queue slowly approached the enemy's position. What is extremely incompatible with the cruel war full of gunpowder smoke and corpses is the unique lightness and poetry of Schubert's music. Schubert, an Austrian musician, is known as the King of Song. He is not only the inheritor of the Viennese classical music tradition, but also the founder of Western European Romantic music. Military March is his 1822 work. Even though it is a bit weird, senior officials in Vienna like this kind of flashy music, so this is also one of the commonly used marches in the Austrian army. Point: if the church's war group fights alone, they will usually use highly religious music such as glory and loyalty. After all, this thing can really reduce the feeling of guilt greatly. Point: on the other hand, the Austrian military music is too melodious, cheerful, and even a little joyful, making people want to dance rather than beat people after listening to it. Point: when I was studying Austrian military music before, I found that neither the army march nor the later Radetzky march would feel out of place in a dance. Point: every time I listen to it, I'm reminded of Madaracha's words. Do you also want to dance? Glory and loyalty incense /U0026 amp. Iron is a piece of music from later generations, but there is no shortage of musical talents in Austria or Vienna. Point: as long as Franz gave the general tone and rhythm, the musicians could quickly compose a lot of scores and perform them live. Point: in fact, in terms of music, Franz also composed a lot of music, but it was just not suitable to be played out at this time. For example, the Mass. 2 flowers bloomed, one on each branch. David Sassoon couldn't help but tremble all over when he saw the black and gold national flag. The incident of being imprisoned in a water cell and fed opium by Franz in Calcutta was still vivid in his mind. Point: now, when he met David Sassoon again, he couldn't help but pee, but he was worthy of being an old cunning man who had experienced many storms. He immediately told his family not to join the war and to follow Kieran Wasj. Point: sure enough, as David Sassoon expected, the Earth King, who had previously boasted about Hakau and inflamed his youngest son's blood, was the first to escape. Point: the two groups met again outside Woonpur city, and both parties smiled tacitly. Your Majesty Kieran, when do you plan to send us away? Don't worry, I know what you're worried about. There are more than one port in Kalakab. I'm the most trustworthy person. As long as the money is in place, I can send you away at any time. But before Kieran Wasj finished speaking, the Austrian army that had rushed out of Bunpul rushed towards him. Point: this was far beyond Kieran Wasj's expectation, because usually the Austrian pursuers would chase down the defeated troops along the way, instead of suddenly rushing towards the unknown hilltop where he was. This is the so-called darkness under the light. Point: just when Kieran Wasj was confused, he found a choking smoke rising from behind. This was the culprit that attracted the Austrian army. Point: but at this time, Kieran Wasj didn't care so much. While asking his men to resist, he mounted a fast horse and prepared to escape. Point: to say that Sassoon and his son were also ruthless people. They directly pulled down the cavalry on the side and grabbed their horses and fled. One of the cavalrymen didn't want to give up his horse, so Victor Sassoon had his head chopped off. Point: in the chaos, people around didn't know what happened. They only knew that a few people escaped from the siege. However, the Sassoons were not professional cavalry and were quickly captured by the Austrian cavalry. Point: Kieran Wasj was worthy of being a hero of the moment. His loyal subordinates decided to continue walking on the main road to attract the enemy and let him escape on the side road. In the end, he successfully escaped the pursuit of the cavalry. Point: it was already dark at this time, and Kieran Wasj rode his horse through a sea of flowers. He smelled a strange fragrance and his physical strength recovered unknowingly. Point: then before Kieran Wasj could feel joy, torches lit up around him. Point: this was the stage where he finally took his final bow. Kieran Wasj, the leader of the group holding the torch, felt that his face was somewhat familiar. Yes, that was his eldest brother's son, Huai Wasj, the hidden danger that Kieran Wasj had been looking for. Uncle, are you okay, Kieran? Wasj pretended to smile and said, ha, 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 ha. Then, he suddenly raised his gun and fired, but there were already two strong men holding giant shields in front of Huai Wasj. Point: Kieran Wasj's old-fashioned single-shot pistol penetrated the seemingly thick shield, but at this time the round lead bullet had been severely deformed and just stuck on the strong man's armor after one hit. It is almost impossible to shoot again. The flintlock pistol used by Kieran Wasj can be completed from priming to loading in less than 2 minutes. Moreover, the power and accuracy of this thing are comparable to modern guns. The pistol is completely incomparable. Even if he is given another chance, it will be difficult to kill the opponent. Okay, you, this traitor, actually united with outsiders to attack my country. The Wasj family has been completely embarrassed by you. You are all Kaleka people. Can you bear to watch this bastard give our land to foreign countries? People, Kiran Vasj is not a person who gives up easily. Even if his last attempt fails, he will still try to create miracles with his mouth pointed. Just that these people are all carefully selected by Huai Vasj, and they all haven't sworn hatred for Kiran Vasj. This kind of person is actually not difficult to find. After all, Kiran Vasj has really done nothing for so many years. By the way, Kalika is actually a slave country. In addition to growing and selling opium, its main business is selling its own citizens to Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. Although the British East India Company announced in 1843 that they had abolished slavery in India, in fact slavery in India still exists even today, let alone 1845. Kiran Vasj, you are the shameless thief. Not only did you take my father's life, you also took his throne. Now Shiva has appeared and asked the Austrians to travel thousands of miles to help me regain the throne. Do you think your subordinates are really loyal to you? Their allegiance is just to the opium in your hands. Look at your feet. Huai Vasj laughed. Only then did Kiran Vasj realize that the sea of flowers he had broken into was a poppy plantation. What do you want to do? This sea of poppies is where you will be buried. Huai Vasj laughed and then ordered his men to start setting fire. Kiran Vasj wanted to ride out of the sea of fire, but when he saw the raging fire igniting around him, the horse's front hooves were raised high and he fell off the horse's back. However, at this time, Kiran Vasj could not feel the pain. The smell of burning poppies entered his nasal cavity, making him feel intoxicated instead. An Austrian journalist recorded the scene on camera as an Austrian official from Tranquilla walked up to Huai Vasj, who was laughing maniacally. Congratulations, Your Majesty. Now perhaps we should talk about compensation. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 661 Viceroyalty of Tanzania. Huge Vasj was a man of little ambition, and in fact he was more in awe than gratitude towards the Austrians. After all, the former Kiran Vasj and Kalikapan were almost invincible in the eyes of the former. However, such a behemoth burst like a balloon in front of the Austrians. Huai Vasj knew his situation very well. He actually had no choice. The strength of this neighbor was far beyond his imagination, and perhaps only the British could match it. But now that the whole of India is in turmoil, it is still unclear whether Britain can maintain its foundation. At this time, it is more important to have good relations with the Austrians. Moreover, the Austrian side's demands are not excessive. The requested territory is just a piece of land close to the interior, and about the same size as Tranquilla. As for the export labor agreement, Huai Vasj felt that the untouchables in his territory had been an eyesore for a long time, and it was really worthwhile to exchange them for money and equipment. As for the promise not to deliver opium to Austria and its colonies and to plant cotton instead, Huai Vasj didn't think it mattered. After all, he had no way of selling opium. In the end, foreign companies stole most of the oil and water. In addition, he also had to criticized by religious figures. In fact, the Varma Plateau and the Ganges Delta in northern India are the main opium producing areas. Too much precipitation in the south is not conducive to the growth of opium. Even if it is grown, it can only be considered a low-grade product. Opium produced in Bangladesh, also known as Pangang, is considered the finest opium in the world. Although growing cotton is not as profitable as growing opium, it is more stable than growing cotton. In fact, this should be regarded as optimizing resource allocation, not a threat. But what Huai Vasj thinks is not important to Austria. France's purpose is to develop the East African plateau with Indian manpower and confuse the water in Sri Lanka. As for that land, it can be used to grow cotton, and it can also be used to confuse the British. At this time, I have to mention the East African Viceroyalty of the Austrian Empire. Franz's original plan was to use the Dutch to develop East Africa, which would save a lot of money and make it easier to receive point as a result. The two consecutive governors of Tanzania could not do anything well with Franz's plan, and the number of immigrants they attracted was not as many as those sent by Franz I. Benny Urban can be said to be a man of great luck who has the right time, location, and people. He started with tens of thousands of colonists and was supported by two empires, Austria and Oman. He was born and raised the East African mixed race boy, has a rare white skin, and is supported by the strongest kingdom in Tanzania. Point as a result, he trusted his black brothers too much, which led to his excessive expansion, which eventually led to the Weijin rebellion. Point. If Friedrich hadn't arrived in time, I'm afraid the viceroyalty of Tanzania would have been reduced to a sea of flames, and the siege of Slave Castle would have reappeared. Point. If the Oman Empire takes the opportunity to add insult to injury, Austria's East African colonies will cease to exist, and they may even have to fight another war with the Oman Empire, or pay huge tolls in order to restore shipping routes. Fortunately, Friedrich directly defeated the Weijin Kingdom's army in the Battle of Paradise Castle. Biru Nyambe, Benny Urban's younger brother, died in the battle, and the proud 10,000 most of the 3,000 indigenous warriors were killed. This was not because the Austrian side's artillery and rifle fire were accurate, but because Biru Nyambe blocked all the exits of Paradise Castle and wanted to hold on with sufficient supplies. As a result, the Austrian Empire directly used the newly developed incendiary rockets, burning the city with fire. In addition, Paradise Castle was close to the seaside and within the attack range of the Austrian navy, so the scene was extremely tragic. The Weijin Kingdom has now disappeared from the world, and all its population, livestock, and property have been occupied by the Ngoni Kingdom, that is loyal to Austria. Of course, Benny Urban also had achievements. For example, he destroyed 3 of the 7 kingdoms in Tanzania, and his brother destroyed 2 more countries. Now that the Weijin Kingdom was destroyed, all the land belonged to the Austrian Empire, which quadrupled the area under its actual control in Tanzania. The remaining Ngoni people worshipped the Austrians as gods, and were landlocked and difficult to exploit. So Franz did not punish Benny Urban, but only removed his title of governor of Tanzania. The second governor was Hendrik van der Meer, a powerful businessman from Bagamoyo. His ideas were similar to those of Franz. They both believed that Tanzania should not look to outsiders for development, and advocated using the land in the region. Advantages in developing agriculture and animal husbandry. In fact, the 57-year-old man wrote a development plan of more than 1 million words to Franz. Just from this word count, Franz knew that he must have been planning for many years, and he should be given a chance to show himself. In fact, Franz has also read Hendrik van der Meer's development plan. Generally speaking, it is quite satisfactory and has a relatively good market analysis. In particular, they saw the serious shortage of food production in the Oman Empire and West Asia, coupled with the continuous fighting within the Abyssinian, Ethiopia, Empire, and the opportunity that Egypt's food self-sufficiency rate plummeted after the failure of the Turkish-Egyptian War. This is a European with very flexible beliefs. He believes in Protestantism in the Netherlands, Catholicism in Austria, and various sects of Shinfa religion in the Arab world. His knowledge of East Africa and West Asia is far beyond ordinary people, and he has extensive connections and has friends everywhere. Franz's previous plans in East Africa were based on cotton and coffee cultivation, supplemented by grain cultivation. In order to avoid conflicts with the Oman Empire, spices and dye crops based on cloves were not planted. Hendrik van der Meer believes that such progress is too slow and is a waste of land resources. Food crop cultivation should be vigorously carried out so as to grasp the lifeblood of the countries in East Africa and West Asia, strengthen the strength of Tanzania, and create a solid foundation for the Austrian Empire. Contribute a lot to the economy. Franz felt that he had at least drawn and seen here, so he allocated a large amount of manpower and material resources to support it. But what Franz didn't expect was that this old man actually wanted to engage in a slavery economy. The reason is that the Omanis can do it, the French can do it, and the Americans can do it, so why can't Austria do it? Although according to econometric calculations, theoretically speaking, the slave economy is a more efficient economic system when sharing a unified market. Researched by Nobel Prize winners in economics, not the author's statement. Forget it is contrary to the laws of the Austrian Empire. The slaves captured in the Tanzania colony are all genuine indigenous black people. Putting aside the issue of language communication, the work efficiency of this group of people was far beyond Hendrive and Amir's imagination. They couldn't even dig a trench well, and in the end they had to rely on the colonists to dig it again. The efficiency of loosening the soil was not as good as that of oxen and horses. What's even more outrageous is that these black people don't know how to use tools. They wear out tens of thousands of shovels and pickaxes in a month. Some people can even break several shovels in a day. At first, the colonists thought that there was a problem with the quality of the tools. As a result, several strong men of the colonists could not break them after turning them around for a long time. They broke after being handed over to the black slaves for a long time. Lazy and greedy, every meal is a war. Strong slaves often rob the weak ones, and those with more people rob those with fewer people. Almost every day, several slaves or colonists will be killed. By later, Hendrive and Amir did the next best thing and prepared to send the slaves to the border wall. In his eyes, this was an easy task, but as a result, the wall fell down when the wind blew and animals touched it. It rained all night and the border wall literally disappeared. Hendrive and Amir had to personally supervise the work and found that the so-called walls were just a mixture of small mounds of earth and stones, not square, but ovals. In addition, black slaves often stole seeds and colonists' belongings. Hendrive and Amir thought that the whip would make these guys behave better, but in the end, the whips were all broken, and those slaves still did what they should do. Seeing that the delivery date was approaching, Hendrive and Amir looked at the black slaves who were eating raw rice, wheat, cotton, and even raw sisal. His eyes went dark, and he fainted. Hendrive and Amir wanted to make a big splash in Tanzania, but he was so angry that he suffered from high blood pressure, cerebral thrombosis, and finally hemiplegia, and could only rest in bed. So now Franz could only take over the affairs of Tanzania himself, but he could not spare so much time to appoint Beni Urbin and Hendrive and Amir as assistants to the governor. Franz's first order was to ask the Omanis to come and take away these black indigenous people. At this time, it was unrealistic for the manpower of the Tanzania colony to develop the Tanzania colony. Even for existing cotton and coffee fields, planting and care are no problem, but picking is definitely a big problem. This is not because the Austrian colonists had steel plates in their legs and could not kneel down, but because the quantity was too large and they could not be finished, and they had to be picked before the second rainy season. Otherwise they would be in vain. East Africa is different from West Africa. West Africa has only one rainy season and one dry season a year, while East Africa has 2 rainy seasons a year. This is actually very tricky. Farming must strictly abide by time rules, and some varieties cannot be planted at all. 2 rainy seasons mean twice the floods. At this time, Europe's infrastructure cannot keep up, let alone Africa. The Water Conservancy project at this time was a joke. Vienna was flooded 3 times and Paris was flooded twice in 20 years. Although no buildings in London were destroyed by floods, the overflowing Thames River caused a large amount of garbage and waste to fill the streets. At the same time, a large amount of stagnant water in the city could not be drained in time, which indirectly led to the occurrence of the London Plague. In 1858, the Danube River flooded, killing hundreds of people in Austria and destroying nearly 1,000 houses, not to mention those in the downstream countries. At this time, there was almost no water conservancy project construction in East Africa, which is one of the reasons why the colonial settlements were all located near the mouths of rivers. In addition, this kind of short-term high-intensity rainfall has also caused another problem, that is, it is extremely difficult to build and maintain roads. Portugal, the Netherlands, Oman, and even the indigenous kingdoms failed to build a road that could connect various cities to the interior for hundreds of years. The floods flowing freely will often wash away the roads, and the continuous heavy rainfall will erase all traces of its existence. There are also swarms of animals and wildly growing plants. Everything tells the story of the great disaster, the wildness of nature. Then there was the biggest problem in colonizing East Africa: terrible diseases. The warm and humid climate here during the rainy season could easily create a large number of mosquitoes, spreading terrible diseases. If it weren't for the trade with the Oman Empire, the output of Tanzania's colonies Cotton and coffee trees would take time, would not be enough to buy quinine. PS. Franz has already developed allicin, and quinine is grown in Chenla and Kalimantan in Southeast Asia, so the loss is not huge. Chenla and Kalimantan are both important quinine producing areas in later generations, so transplanting is not too difficult, although it took several years to successfully plant it. So where can we find labor that is disease resistant, cheap, and good at growing food and cotton? The answer is India. Asson's anti-drug talent is at the full level. At least Franz doesn't have the courage to challenge the clean and healthy Ganges river water, of course. In addition to this, from an economic perspective, India is close enough to Tanzania and is also affected by the monsoon. The time for transporting labor is greatly shortened, and the mortality rate, loss rate, can also be reduced. During this period, whether they were black slaves or indentured workers, the attrition rate during the journey would exceed 15%, and it was possible that the attrition rate would be close to 50% in case of emergencies. The journey from Tranquilla to Bagamoyo does not have this problem at all. It only takes more than 10 days due to the influence of ocean currents and monsoons, which is really short for a sea journey. Moreover, Dalits, as untouchables, are not property to the local Indian princes, but complete garbage. Modern people always like to say that the island country has no human rights when Japanese samurai chop people to test their swords, but those samurai still have to find a good excuse, such as being hit or insulted. Button. India, there really is no reason for the upper castes to kill the untouchables. It can be that a shadow falls on someone else's feet, their smell is smelt, or even footprints are left on the road. Reasons to kill. And even today, these atrocities against Dalits have not stopped. India does not need Dalits. From the mouth of a famous Indian politician. They are spurned, exploited, and oppressed by society. They are all landless farm laborers and people engaged in unclean industries, usually laundry workers, sweepers, butchers, etc. Even as the lowest level of excrement workers, they do not have the right to obtain excrement. Those dung belong to the Shudras, fourth level, who lead them, and are also responsible for driving. According to ancient Indian traditions, people of any caste cannot come into contact with lower class people like them, or accept things used by them to avoid being defiled. They also have no right to enter temples and various religious places, let alone schools to receive education. In the 19th century, not only did these Dalits have no surnames, many of them even had no names. Dali specifically refers to the oppressed person, and at the same time, is called the untouchable. But for Franz, there were no more suitable pioneers to go to Africa at this time. These people have been enslaved by the caste system for a long time, and their humble obedience has been ingrained in their bones. But compared with the original African indigenous people, their sociality and organization are much better, and they can learn new things much faster than black people. In Silicon Valley in the United States, Dalits account for a large proportion of Indian origin senior engineers. Indian origin executives are not included here, because Dalits are relatively unsuitable as managers. Hearing that the Austrians wanted Dalit laborers, Huge Vasja immediately expressed his willingness to cooperate, and the price was easy to negotiate, so he could just give him whatever he wanted. Chapter 662 Challenger. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Watch it. Lakshmi Pai made a beautiful flying kick, but as soon as she spoke, Franz shot her down from the air and pinned her to the sand. It uses fine sand, so it won't cause any harm. Are you making such a loud noise to scare people to death? Franz joked, while Maria, Franz's sister and fourth child, on the side pouted unhappily. Brother knows how to bully others. How can she beat you at such a young age? She said she wanted to beat 10 of them. If those guys who don't know the seriousness of their actions are allowed to come, she will be punished even worse. Then, if you win, you can fight 10. Maria asked timidly. No. Franz answered simply. Franz's frankness made the two little girls speechless for a while, and then they were thrown into confusion. It's just that the former easily jumped back to avoid it, but a gust of wind blew over, and they were the ones injured again. During this period, Miss Joan of Arc and little Maria from India got along well. They happened to be girls born in the same year, and they both liked singing, dancing, eating sweets, and they didn't like reading. This fully proves that some things can break through the boundaries of language and country. In fact, it's not that Lakshmi Pai doesn't like reading, it's just that he can't read German, and everyone in the classroom will look at it with strange eyes. In comparison, she is much better at martial arts and riding. It's just that Lakshmi Pai was once again poured cold water on her two most confident aspects. In the face of the absolute gap in size and strength, any martial arts is just fancy. As for equestrian skills, it's not like there are no horses in Schönbrunn Palace. However, Franz was afraid of hurting his younger brothers and sisters, so Lakshmi Pai could only show off her riding skills on a pony. The pony raised by Franz is not the British Shetland pony common in Europe, with a shoulder height of about 75 to 90 centimeters, but a Dali horse shipped from the Far East. This kind of horse is very docile and likes to be close to people. It is mainly taller than the British pony and can accompany its owner for a longer period of time. Although this kind of horse usually only has a shoulder height of 90 to 105 centimeters, it has super endurance and can carry up to 200 kilograms of luggage. At the same time, the running was still very slow, and Lakshmi Pai did not feel like riding a big horse at all. Little Maria on the other side felt very happy riding her pony, because it was rare to have anyone riding with her. In fact, there are even higher level horses in Schönbrunn Palace, alpine horses with a shoulder height between 1.2 meters and 1.4 meters. This is a kind of horse native to Austria. It has a docile temperament, an elegant body, a long mane, and very beautiful hair, which is usually golden or silver. In fact, there are Finnish horses and Mongolian horses that are almost as tall. However, the former is a cold-blooded horse. Although it has a quiet and calm personality, riding it feels like riding a draft horse, which makes people very uncomfortable. At the same time, the hair is too thick and is not suitable for living in Austria. As for the latter's bad temper, Franz didn't dare let a bunch of naughty kids ride a horse that could kick a wolf to death. In fact, there are many famous horses in the stables of Schönbrunn Palace, but the Franz family has no interest in riding horses, so they usually can only stay in the stables occasionally during picnics. These horses are released, but they are not used for riding, but simply kept as pets. In addition, little Maria's accent became more and more strange as she and Lakshmi Pai were together for a long time, and she often exchanged her pure gold and sterling silver ornaments with the latter's gold-plated and silver-plated baubles. The reason is very strange. That is, Maria thinks other people's jewelry is lighter. However, Franz would not let the two little guys continue to be so lawless. They had to go to the classroom in the palace every day, and after that, they had to receive physical training from Franz. But Lakshmi Pai was obviously more interested in politics, and Franz did not shy away from telling her directly that there was a war going on in the Indian subcontinent. However, Franz's judgment disappointed the former. Franz's judgment was that the Indian states were all a bunch of rabble. The princes who led these uprisings neither wanted to restore the Mughal dynasty nor had the ambition to establish themselves as kings, so when the external aggression ended and the British turned their guns, they would surrender as soon as possible. Lakshmi Pai is a very proud Indian. She feels that what Franz said is completely biased and nonsense without evidence. How can those big shots be as bad as Franz said? Franz was not surprised. After all, Joan of Arc. So he took out the letters written by Indian princes to himself and the Austrian Empire, including Rao II, Prince of Zanxi, whom Lakshmi Pai admired most. She could hardly believe her eyes. Those big men actually sold their country to foreigners and wrote in such disgusting ways. In fact, in addition to writing to me, they probably also wrote to the British in French, and maybe they will write to the Prussians and Americans in the future. Franz stabbed Lakshmi Pai again in the chest. Lakshmi Pai gritted her teeth and clenched her fists without speaking. Little Maria on the side quickly hugged the other person and comforted him. You can write me one, so that you will also be an Austrian in the future. We can play together every day. Franz was speechless for a while and quickly slipped Maria, the little fool, away. 3 feet of ice cannot be frozen in a day. The Mughal dynasty has decayed, and you can't save it. India needs to change, and so do you. Will the Austrian Empire invade India like the British did? Lakshmi Pai shouted after Franz. If possible, I don't want to get involved, but I bought a piece of land from you not long ago. How can I change this, Lakshmi? Pei asked formally. Although he was not old, Franz felt an unusual temperament. Maybe he was a hero. Franz looked at the little mirror he was holding in his hands. Look at me. Go. Let's play. Franz threw little Mariah on the grass and looked at the girl in front of him and said, go to class first. Only by knowing yourself and your enemy can you be victorious in every battle. Although the Austrian Empire is somewhat different from the British, some knowledge is common. At the same time, you also need to know yourself, otherwise you cannot truly know yourself and your enemy. Many people only see the enemy's weaknesses. The enemy is corrupt and incompetent, and they think they can seize the opportunity, but they don't know how powerful they are. They cannot escape the fate of failure in the end. Understood? Go to class tomorrow. Lakshmi Pei asked, aren't you afraid that I will defeat you? Franz was a little helpless. First of all, I'm not your enemy, and secondly, you can't defeat me. Before you say something like this next time, you'd better think about who is the enemy and who is your friend. Otherwise, no matter how hard you try, it will be in vain and may even be counterproductive. Then what if I beat you, Lakshmi? Pei still refused to give up, and Franz felt that the child must have got into trouble. Don't you always think that the pony is not strong enough? If you can beat me, I will let you ride as a horse. It just so happens that you can also find some ground, but I still suggest that you learn to cooperate and win-win. Chapter 663 Christmas Eve is not peaceful. December 24th, 1845. Christmas Eve. In the first year that she took over Vienna's business affairs, Perini Schaffer posed a problem for Franz. Of the 17 senior executives in Vienna, the former asked to replace 11. The charges against these people include corruption, bribery, embezzling royal property, using power to seek positions and benefits for relatives and friends, buying and selling, dereliction of duty, lynching, abuse of power, and leaking state secrets. The vast majority of them committed all these crimes. In fact, corruption, bribery, and bribery were a very common phenomenon in the 19th century. However, Franz still underestimated the greed and courage of these people. Although some industries have just been established for 2 or 3 years, the amount of corruption actually accounts for 15% to 30% of the total profits. Some industries have even been monopolized by one or several families. In fact, before the corruption incident broke out, Franz thought it might not have much impact. After all, many industries have just started, and there are not so many available talents at the moment. Can you trust some people who are more familiar with the family? The issue of family monopoly can be solved slowly in the future after the industry gets on the right track. Now many industries in Austria are still in the stage of staking their claim. However, the multi-million-dollar corruption made Franz unable to sit still. You must know that in the 19th century, 100 florins was enough for ordinary people to live for a year, and this is only in Vienna, and there is no nationwide inventory. In fact, Franz was not completely ignorant of corruption, and he had dealt with a number of people in the process, but now it seems that the so-called killing of chickens to scare monkeys does not seem to have much effect. But handling nearly 10,000 people at once would probably cause a lot of chaos. Dealing with some people and winning over the majority is the normal way of dealing with it, right? But Franz didn't want to do that, and his industry was not the Austrian Empire, which was in critical condition and would collapse at a touch point. Franz will verify the crimes of these people and give them corresponding punishments, including fines, demotion, expulsion, debt repayment. This refers not to wages, but assets, imprisonment, exile, and death. Franz directly called all the people in charge of the entire Vienna area on Christmas Eve, and there was a wave of Austrian version of raging against the ministers. Zaza. This line will be published separately one day, so I won't write it here, to avoid talking about the word count. Of course, Franz still had to comfort himself after he was bleeding. Franz has prepared a Christmas gift for all employees in Vienna, and a dedicated person will distribute it tomorrow. This made those people's tense nerves relax a little. After all, the dark clouds seemed to have passed. In fact, compared to the 13th month's salary, opening a blind box is more attractive to Westerners. Moreover, Franz is a member of the royal family. To the Austrians, these gifts are not just gifts, but also an honor. Especially for the common people, it is not too much to take them home as heirlooms. However, after this incident, Franz felt that the supervision model should be strengthened. He could not always count on the emergence of such people who were not afraid of power, and could directly send intelligence to him. Generally speaking, the high salary to support the incorruptible was not feasible in Vienna at this time, because the money Franz paid these people was considered the highest salary in the entire Europe. However, the economy of the Austrian Empire at this time was developing too fast, and the temptation was far beyond the bottom line of ordinary people, so corruption and embezzlement were so common. Institutional problems can only be solved slowly, but regulatory agencies can be established immediately. First of all, relying on self-inspection and mutual inspection is definitely unreliable. Vienna is a society of acquaintances. Franz doesn't want to say more. Generally, nobles who can achieve a certain level of publicity can have some kinship with each other. Doing so will only bring the group closer together and brainstorm ways to deal with Franz. Therefore, an independent review agency must be established. Eleni Schaffer can set up her own review agency, but there must also be an independent review agency directly loyal to Franz. In addition, lower level supervision and reporting are also very important. However, due to limited technological and administrative capabilities at this time, only real name reporting can be accepted. In ancient times in the East, when people complained to officials, they had to roll a nail board or make a plank. 50 big boards, in fact, 20 big boards can cripple a person, and 40 big boards can basically kill someone. Therefore, in some historical dramas nowadays, the heroines disguise themselves as men and are beaten with 200 to 500 military sticks at every turn. This is basically nonsense. If they were really beaten, they would be beaten to a pulp. So whether it's rolling nails or beating boards, it's usually a narrow escape. But this is not bad compared to the West. Before the French Revolution, a commoner could not even sue officials. Even if you spend a lot of money to hire a lawyer, it will usually be offset by the other party's immunity. Yes, officials at the time had judicial immunity from complaints filed by civilians, unless the common people can ask their aristocratic lords. Those aristocratic lords are usually the same as the officials. After all, they are of the same class. In fact, generally speaking, the noble lord is the judge of his own land. After all, there was something called territorial jurisdiction at that time. The so-called territorial jurisdiction is a million times more evil than the notorious consular jurisdiction in history. The latter still requires legal basis, but the former is the law itself. It basically means I make the decision on my territory. The referees, judges, and audience are all mine, so you can fight with me over anything you want. Therefore, compared with the nail rolling and beating boards of the East, the judicial system of the West is even more despairing. Here we only refer to the major powers on the European continent, excluding some free states and republics. By the way, territorial jurisdiction lasted in some parts of Hungary until the end of World War I, and did not disappear completely until the end of World War II. Of course, it would be another matter if the commoner was really lucky enough to squeeze into the royal court. After all, it was set up by the royal families of various countries specifically to deal with local nobles. However, this thing is usually located in the capital, or it travels around, and there are not many opportunities for real civilians to enter, and even in the royal court, everything depends on evidence. Officials are usually familiar with the law and can hire excellent lawyers at high prices to defend themselves, and they can bribe judges openly. However, even if the royal court decides, the case will eventually have to be transferred to the House of Lords, the court of honor. Anyway, there are many opinions for trial. This is true for civilians, not to mention the widespread serfs even during the French Revolution. During the period of the constitutional monarchists and the Girondins, those officials could not so casually point. Until Robespierre came to power, a new era of European justice was created. After that, it took nearly 100 years intermittently before the judicial democracy promoted by the West came into being. Accepting real name reports was a pioneering work in the 19th century. Although this would cause dissatisfaction among some people, Franz was not only the largest capitalist in Austria at this time, but also the largest aristocrat. Moreover, this is an internal matter of Franz company, and even if someone is dissatisfied, they can only suppress it. Chapter 664 Christmas. December 25th, 1845. Christmas. On this day, a strange scene has appeared in the streets and alleys of Vienna since morning. Santa Claus in green clothes, green hat and carriages everywhere. The Santa Claus of the 19th century was not yet the red coat, red hat, sleigh, and reindeer that we are familiar with in later generations. In fact, the image and identity of Santa Claus in Europe are different in different time periods and in different countries. Sometimes he is a bishop with a halo on his head and a whip. Sometimes he is a sad but strong farmer. Sometimes he was a hairy, pot-bellied savage. In some parts of Germany he was a terrifying witch with a mouth full of iron teeth. The image of modern Santa Claus originated in the United States. In 1821, American writer William Gilley first proposed the image of red coat, red hat, sleigh and reindeer in children's friends. But when it comes to Austria, this image will change. First of all, sleighs and reindeer are difficult to see in Austria, so they were directly replaced by the most common horse-drawn carriage. Secondly, red clothes and red hats are the colors of Spain in the eyes of Austrians. The former prefers green, thinking that it represents luck and beauty. Then there is the bag carried on the back. In the German region, the image of carrying a bag on the shoulders is usually considered to be a farmer or a thief. So the cloth bags were changed to boxes packed with colored paper. In fact, this was also to consume inventory. In fact, the sales volume of colored paper in Austria was far less than expected, and these colored papers actually still have a shelf life. This was the first time Franz knew that paper also had a shelf life. In this era, due to technical limitations, colored paper would naturally fade after 6 to 8 months instead of letting it rot in a warehouse. It's better to show it off. The Austrian Empire often did this in history, even borrowing money from bankers to show its national strength, which is commonly known as slapping a bloated face and pretending to be fat. The Santa Clauses filling the streets are actually employees of companies owned by Franz or priests who have volunteered to help. Roman Catholics actually do not recognize this alienated image of Santa Claus. They believe that only Bishop St. Nicholas is the real Santa Claus, but the affairs of the Holy See have nothing to do with Austria. Under Franz's transformation, the Austrian Church had long since parted ways with Orthodox Catholicism. So, when Franz did this, not only did no priests jump out to oppose it, but many people chose to join it. In fact, through these years of changes, the church's clergy have long known how to adapt to the new era. What's more, the church is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the reform. The Austrian church's current situation is largely due to Franz's transformation. In particular, the emergence of the Chandler theocracy allowed the Austrian church to have its own Vatican. Although Chandler nominally belonged to the Chandler royal family and was actually a vassal colony of the Austrian Empire, this did not prevent the priests from fighting for their own take pride in what you do. In order to save manpower and ensure fairness and safety, Franz did not choose to send gifts door to door. Instead, people park the carriage in a designated area and wait for employees to pick it up. At the same time, specialized people maintain order and log in. In this era, it was very dangerous for a carriage loaded with valuable goods to travel repeatedly through the streets, even in big cities like Vienna, Paris, and London. Pickpockets, gangsters, and desperate gamblers might all take risks at the same time. The possibility of self-stealing is not impossible. Even if each box is wrapped, no one knows what is inside. But this did not prevent those guys from joining together to embezzle these goods. After all, there was no monitoring at the time. However, in public, they will still restrain themselves. In addition, Franz also took other preventive measures, such as multi-party supervision. But in fact, no one wants to make themselves miserable at Christmas, especially when Franz is dealing with 10,000 people at a time. Even the most greedy person will be restrained for the time being. Because they saw Franz's determination and difference, there were actually many people waiting to see the show, but no one dared to stand up and confront Franz after all. Nobles usually have nothing to do with the future emperor, and those capitalists still rely on the goods in Franz's factory to make money, let alone seek death. As for civilians and scholars, their voice is not as big as imagined, and Franz did not harm their interests. The gifts distributed by Franz are mainly food, slow-moving items and consumer coupons. Of course, the value of food and slow-moving items will be slightly higher than that of consumer coupons. This behavior actually reduces the threat of inflation, because Franz has too much gold and silver in his hands, and if these things are put into the market at once, they will immediately explode. After all, the gold diggers in the United States back then could be described as unorganized, undisciplined, unqualified, and without command, but Franz was directly digging for gold using methods that were far superior to the technology at the time, coupled with an efficient organizational structure. The production of gold was much higher than that of California at the same time in history. In addition, Franz also collected gold and silver from all over the world to Vienna. The domestic gold price in Japan and the Far East is much higher than the international market, so Franz carried out large-scale arbitrage. This operation alone can bring Austria's gold reserves to a higher level. Although having no money is absolutely impossible, having too much money is not necessarily a good thing. For example, as long as Franz throws his gold into the market at this time, it will immediately cause gold to depreciate, followed by terrible inflation. Although it can shock all countries in a short period of time and gain a certain advantage in international competition, there are not enough valuable products at this time, so it is Franz who suffers in the end. This kind of behavior is equivalent to lowering the price of your own goods, spending money to buy yourself suffering. Therefore, the currency that Franz put into the market was just in line with the economic development of the Austrian Empire. As for what this number is, it was not decided by Franz himself, but calculated by dozens or even hundreds of economists. The good news is that with the economic development of the Austrian Empire, the amount of currency required by the market is increasing, which means that Franz can slowly put these precious metals into the market. But even this will cause inflation to a certain extent. But the existence of the German customs union and the Apennine customs union has greatly prevented the outflow of precious metals from the Austrian Empire. At the same time, because he has enough precious metals in his hands, France is more confident in foreign trade, especially in monopolizing some commodities and affecting the regional situation. For example, the British war quagmire in southern Brazil at this time is actually inseparable from France. How could a poor and weak agricultural country be able to withstand the combined army led by the British Empire, the largest power in the world at this time? The United Legion refers to the United Kingdom, Argentina, and Uruguay. Chapter 665 Outrageous. The reason why the Brazilians were able to block the joint attack of the three countries in the south was not only due to the complex terrain and bad weather, but also inseparable from the support of the Austrian Empire. Although Pedro II is known as the greatest Brazilian in history, as an emperor who reigned for 59 years, what he did is really not enough. Those who reigned for about the same length of time were Kangxi, Louis XIV, the Sun King, Victoria, Shapa II, the famous resurgence king in Persian history, and Basil II, the last glory of the Byzantine Empire. Of course, there was someone in history who lived longer than Pedro II, and was also the ruler of a great country, but his ending was worse than him. That is Franz Joseph I, the founder of World War I. Pedro II was still very young at this time. After coming to power, his series of policies directly offended all the landowners and nobles who supported him, especially the abolition of slavery, which simply pushed him to the opposite side of the country. In 1844, it even rejected the British Trade and Navigation Agreement, which allowed British goods exported to Brazil to only pay an ad valorem tax of 25%. The reason why Pedro II did this may be different from the modern mainstream analysis of protecting domestic industry and commerce, because Brazil at that time had almost no industry and was completely a large plantation. But at that time, Brazil's national treasury was empty and its precious metal reserves were seriously insufficient. The reason why he wanted to raise import tariffs was largely to prevent the outflow of silver and ease the financial crisis caused by the war. The Brazilian Civil War has been discussed in previous books, so I won't go into details here. In short, the war lasted for several years, and the cost was naturally borne by the country. It is understandable that Pedro II wanted to make money. After all, the power in his emperor's hands was pitiful, and there was nothing else valuable enough to make people work for him. Although France has been importing large amounts of rubber from Brazil, Brazilian planters are really unmotivated. Even after so many years, the output of rubber is still hovering between 600 and 700 tons. Moreover, the money from rubber transactions will not go directly to the Brazilian government. They can only make profits through tax collection, and the actual income will be even less. In fact, it is precisely because the Brazilian government imposes too many taxes on rubber transactions that the estate owners lack interest in expanding planting. Of course, the characteristics of the rubber tree itself are also an important reason, because the planting cycle is too long, which means it takes a lot to get back the cost. During this period, no one can guarantee that the market will remain stable. As we all know, what farmers hate most is risk. So compared to these weird things, rubber and quinine, Brazil prefers to grow wheat, coffee and sugar. After all, these are the things that people can't live without. However, at Franz's strong request, Brazilians also began to grow cotton, although the yield was still appalling. The Austrian Empire's support for Brazil is to pay to monopolize Brazil's cotton and rubber, as well as the development rights of part of the wasteland. This can not only ensure that Brazil will not be defeated by the British, but also ensure its own strategic resources to a certain extent. Safety. In fact, the money will return to the Austrian Empire sooner or later. After all, France is just borrowing money, and Pedro II of Brazil naturally cannot buy weapons or supplies with the enemy. Therefore, it is good to have strong industrial capabilities. If you step on the left foot and the right foot, you can spiral into the sky. It is obviously to plunder other countries' resources, but the other country still has to say thank you. In fact, Pedro II still somewhat despised France. After all, the former was a young emperor at the age of 14, while the latter was 15 years old and still making money everywhere like a Jew. Pedro II even wrote a letter to Franz, inviting the latter to be the former's finance minister. It's just that the letter was torn into pieces by Mrs. Sophie. In fact, Franz still wanted to keep it. After all, if something unexpected happened, it would be a way out, right? If it doesn't work, you can ask someone else to top the tank. It's just that this behavior of Pedro II was no different from provocation in the eyes of the Austrians, but they would just laugh at it, because the former was a bumpkin. After hearing about this, Maximilian had a rare chance to talk to Franz, his eldest brother, and the former expressed his envy to the latter for having such a confidant. Then he started having chicken soup for the soul and talking to Franz. A real man should start from scratch and make his own way overseas, and he should not let down the friendship of his friends. This kind of opportunity is rare. You can prove yourself only after hard work, and hard work can you gain a sense of fulfillment. In fact, being an emperor is not necessarily very happy. You see, grandpa worked so hard, but what did he get in exchange for his life? It is better to be like Prime Minister Metternich. Although he is a minister, he has all the power and reputation. Maximilian almost said directly to Franz, "Brave young man, go and create a miracle. I will be the Emperor of Austria for you." Franz just looked at his competitive brother silently and said, "You have made progress, but as I told you before, you should keep your eyes open and your ears open to all directions. It's easy for you to ignore other people when you just stare at me." Then, the second child, Maximilian, was taken away by the ears by Madame Sophie, who was listening closer to home. The gifts Franz gave to his employees actually contained quite a lot of private goods. For example, toothpaste and soap. In fact, these two things are nothing new, but the popularity rate is still pitifully low. Even if they are endorsed by the royal family and allowed to be promoted by the church all day long, many people are reluctant to buy them. Compared with these cleaning supplies, red phosphorus matches, a new fire-making tool, are very popular across Europe. The advantage of red phosphorus matches is that they are more stable in performance and non-toxic than yellow phosphorus matches. Before the Austrians invented the red phosphorus match, Historically, the Austrians also invented the red phosphorus match. The yellow phosphorus matches commonly used in countries around the world were the French Solier and the German camelot point. Yellow phosphorus matches are easy to use, but they are too sensitive to fire and can easily cause fires. Moreover, during the manufacturing and use process, yellow phosphorus was highly toxic, which resulted in high labor costs and disgusted the rich and nobles at the time. Austrian red phosphorus matches are different. Not only are they non-toxic, they are more stable, and you can smell the aroma of burning wood. They are called matches for nobles. It's just that this thing doesn't have much technological content, and it's not difficult for powerful countries to imitate it, so France didn't make much extra money from it. In fact, except for the German Customs Union, the Apennine Customs Union, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and Austrian colonies, Austrian matches are not allowed to enter at all. Heavy taxes are imposed. What's more, the French church openly declares that the unpleasant gas of matches is God's punishment for human original sin, while the aroma of Austrian matches is the temptation of the devil. Then the original fire starter became a luxury item in Paris, the fashion capital. A group of upper-class celebrities and gentlemen even gathered to strike matches to show off their wealth. Chapter 666. Hugo is coming. On a cold winter day, Hugo lit a match in an alley. The shining fire was like a small sun, making him feel a little warm. At this time, Vienna is full of happy people, either waiting for the distribution of gifts or busy preparing for the festival. However, at this time, Hugo cancelled the rent on Christmas Day, and when he left the hotel, he was actually penniless. Hugo had previously tried to publish articles in Vienna newspapers in exchange for royalties, but Austrian newspapers presented two extremes: either they are too professional or too commercial, and they also have a common feature: they are extremely political. There was no way around it, not to mention the overwhelming censorship agencies and secret police in the Austrian Empire. Even Franz would not give up the position of public opinion easily. Hugo was indeed a great literateur, but his German was very limited, and it was almost impossible for French articles to appear in Austrian newspapers. The result was that the editors repeatedly rejected the manuscript and asked Hugo to rewrite it in German. This made him extremely angry. At the same time, because of his literary character and noble French blood, Hugo did not allow himself to bow to others. Then Hugo tried another way of showing off, that is selling out on singing. It's just that in Vienna, the capital of music, his skill, which is usually praised by friends, is really not worth mentioning. The reason why Mr. Hugo has fallen to this point has to be told a few months ago, when he encountered a very knowledgeable and enthusiastic girl in Vienna. Tina took Hugo to visit many places, including Vienna's monuments, the Academy of Sciences, the theater, the Central Garden, the Imperial Hotel, the Caesar Hotel, Korntenstrasse, Grabenstrasse, Mischstrasse, Hilfestrasse, etc. With this excellent guide, Hugo could naturally better understand the country. His impression of the Austrian Empire had greatly changed, and he even began to feel melancholy about the fate of France. Because this neighbor has changed so much. Although their idiot emperor doesn't care about anything, there are royal properties everywhere, and people are willing to believe in the royal family. Therefore, the capitalists who make all the difference in France are nothing in Austria. They can only crawl behind the royal family and pick up some scraps. Not only that, the contradictions and scapegoats that emerged in economic development were ultimately blamed on businessmen and bankers. The taming of kings and nobles by capitalists was almost non-existent, as almost all nobles took shares in royal companies. The result is that no capitalist can defeat this financial monster that combines the strength of all the Austrian nobility. Therefore, the Austrian nobles are still proud at this time, but this pride comes from loyalty to the country and the royal family, not blood. In fact, this is the result of Franz's screening using several economic crises and trust crises. Coupled with the momentum of public opinion, it is easy to come up with a new standard. Hugo was actually mentally prepared before coming to Vienna. He felt that France might be slightly inferior to Austria in terms of music. However, when I arrived, I discovered that the gap between the two sides was not as big as usual. Of course, this does not mean that the Paris music scene is not good. The music scene in Paris at this time can be said to be full of stars, but the music scene in Vienna at this time can be described as vast as the Milky Way. In addition, some new performance modes, or some retro performances also gave Hugo a considerable shock. Drama is nothing new in Europe. It can even be traced back to the ancient Greek period. There are also similar citizen dramas in modern Germany. But it has to be said that this model only came to life in Vienna at this time. In fact, the threshold for appreciating drama is lower than the threshold for appreciating songs, dances, and musicals compared with the development level of drama in the Austrian Empire at this time. Hugo was even more surprised by the number of people who came to watch it. Because there are not many theaters in Vienna, but they can be full. Hugo felt that people in this country must love culture and art, but in fact it was due to the economic development of the Austrian Empire that people were richer than in the past. After people meet the most basic needs of clothing, food, housing, and transportation, they will begin to try higher level pursuits. But most of them have limited appreciation due to their culture and origin. Therefore, drama, an art mode with a lower threshold, became popular, and at the same time, a type of sketch drama called cabaret became popular. Although it is called a sketch drama, it is more like an Eastern crosstalk, a truly virtuous Junge. At the same time, classical songs, dances, and musicals also shocked Hugo. It can even be said that this traditional model has reached its peak in Austria. In fact, due to the existence of the German customs union and the Apennine customs union, coupled with Franz's money-making ability, Vienna actually gathered all the outstanding artists from North Germany to southern Italy. At the same time, due to their alliance with Russia, Russian artists who were already yearning for Europe also flocked to Franz's invitation. Every scene Hugo saw was actually carefully arranged by Franz. Even the tour guide who had been following the former Tina was still a little surprised by the order given directly from Mr. K or Franz. After all, the latter actually had very little interference in the entertainment industry. Moreover, Credia should be responsible for the tour guide, and she is very willing to do this kind of work, especially if she can get in touch with some big shot. If you have to get close to a target and extract information, Flaglava, a gypsy, is obviously better at it. But since it is work, Tina will take it seriously. Compared with those who are ambitious, with unrealistic dreams, she feels that being ordinary is the real thing. It's just that Tina doesn't quite understand a writer. Is it necessary for her to come in person? As soon as the two parties came into contact, Tina touched Hugo completely. She couldn't understand why it was necessary to go to such great lengths for such an ordinary person. In fact, the reason why Franz chose Tina was that she was young enough. As far as Franz knew, Hugo had just lost his beloved daughter not long ago. At this time, it would have been easier to get close to Hugo if Tina was white, thin and young. In fact, what Franz didn't know was that Hugo's daughter was not young when she died. She was already an adult and married. In addition, the most common people encountered in the theater were literati and noble children. Any of the four former prima donnas can easily handle Hugo. Even if they find a more senior dancer or actor from any theater, they can easily handle it. Although Hugo was one of the greatest writers in French history and a giant in the history of European literature, he was nothing special in Tina's eyes at the same time. Franz was very afraid of writers like Hugo and Dickens. If he was not careful, he might be criticized by such people and nailed to the pillar of shame. So, in order to ask her to leave, Franz decided to play a ground puppet trick. That is, let Hugo support and call Tina for her stage dream, and at the same time drain him of his money, so that he had to leave Vienna. Chapter 667 Hugo is gone. In the gap between two rows of luxurious buildings, in a corner, where the sun could not shine in, Hugo lit the second match. The aroma of fried carp entered his nostrils. French people rarely eat carp, and they prefer to eat oysters at Christmas. The French eat oysters really raw, with at most a few drops of lemon juice or ginger juice. At this time, Hugo recalled the days when he had red wine and oysters in Paris. At that time, French oysters were very cheap and were once called poor people's food. However, after some people began to associate oysters, truffles with certain abilities, wild oysters in France were almost extinct. There is a poem that praises, there is spring all year round in the Louvre, and the frogs in Europe are new. I eat 300 oysters a day, and I will live a long life as a Gaul. The French are also called European frogs because they eat everything, such as snails, rabbits, and frogs, foods that Europeans usually don't eat. In fact, France's carp breeding plan was ultimately successful, but he did not use the famous Asian carp, but the European native mirror carp, which is often referred to as the three scales in the East in later generations compared with the slow Asian carp. The mirror carp is more alert and faster, and its breeding speed is much higher than that of its Asian counterpart, 20% higher, so it can live in European rivers, where there are a lot of predatory fish. There is really no technical content in carp farming. This kind of fish has no dreams. As long as it has food and drink, it will reproduce like crazy, with large output and strong disease resistance. How could such excellent ingredients not attract the attention of Europeans? In fact, during the Middle Ages, Europeans raised a large number of carps. At its peak, France alone had nearly 80,000 hectares of fish ponds. However, with the advent of the Age of Discovery, it became very easy to obtain marine fish, especially the Dutch herring fishing industry that directly overtook the European carp farming industry. Marine fish have greater advantages than freshwater fish. Not only do they have less earthy smell and fewer spines, but they are also very cheap. At that time, fishing was more stable than farming. This was mainly because the population in Europe was too small at that time, and the cost of carp farming was too high at that time. Coupled with the impact of a series of wars such as the 30 Years' War, this jointly led to the depression of the carp breeding industry. So, when Franz proposed the carp farming plan, the church that was most opposed to it was the church that usually supported him the most. Because the carp breeding industry used to be dominated by the church, but because of this, they know better than anyone else how low the profits in this industry are and how high the risks are. After all, there are a lot of floods in Austria, and several large rivers often overflow. At this time, the carp breeding industry is still facing a very embarrassing situation. That is, those who can afford it do not eat it, and those who eat it cannot afford it. In the past, the price of 1 kilogram of carp was equivalent to more than 8 kilograms of beef or 20 loaves of bread. However, due to the advent of the Age of Discovery and the introduction of large quantities of marine fish to European dining tables, the price of carp has been reduced to a very low level. After the 16th century, nobles and businessmen found sea fish that tasted better and were easier to cook. As for the poor who could not even eat meat, they were even less likely to waste their hard-earned savings on carp. But something is different now. That is, with the development of the times, the citizen class has stepped onto the stage of history. These people do not have the spending power of the aristocracy, and at the same time they are not willing to associate with the peasants. Coupled with Austria's cultural and historical traditions, France feels that carp farming is completely interesting. As for the water quality issues plaguing the church, Franz thinks it is not difficult to solve. Carp is actually a bottom fish. As long as grass carp and silver carp are added, the water quality can be self-purified, and some shellfish can be raised to complete the self-cycle. It's just that three-dimensional breeding and the like were considered crazy by people at the time. A group of zoologists even stood up and refuted Franz's nonsense. Archduke Franz, how is it possible for 3 families to live in a small house? They can live in the attic, ground floor and basement respectively. How is that possible? They are just a group of animals. Even if it is true as I told you, there is no way to avoid friction between the 3 families, sir. But they are not people. Animals are sometimes more disciplined than people. Franz's words left a group of zoologists speechless, but they were all aggrieved and waiting for a good show. However, the reality is that the fish really coexist peacefully, which directly triples the output of the unit fish pond. As for the reproduction of grass carp and silver carp, it is said to be one of the 10 impossible problems in the history of human agriculture, but in Franz's eyes it really doesn't matter after all. The problems that have troubled mankind for thousands of years can be easily solved by even a rural ant in future generations. Pituitary suspension is the key. Although it sounds very noble, it is actually the brain of a fish entering the mating period. Since the Austrians were not obsessed with eating fish heads anyway, Franz simply kept the fish heads and removed the brains to stimulate the reproduction of grass carp and silver carp point. After several years of experimentation, these technologies have basically matured. Therefore, the output of farmed freshwater fish in the Austrian Empire in 1845 directly reached 1,000 tons, equivalent to the entire Austria, and each person could be allocated 20 grams. However, this is only in the experimental stage, and there is definitely hope to expand this number 100 times in the future. The food and grass were not yet moved, but the soldiers and horses went first. Although Franz's fish pond had not been dug yet, he decided to put out the advertisement first. 1,000 tons of freshwater fish may be a joke to the Austrian Empire, but it is definitely a saturation blow to the citizens of Vienna. At this time, almost every household in Vienna was cooking carp, but Austrians only had two ways to cook fish, either fried or grilled. In short, the smell of carp is everywhere in Vienna at Christmas, and Franz also used this carp disaster to change people's inherent perception of carp prices. By the way, the Austrian Empire's marine fishery catch at this time was only slightly stronger than that of the Kingdom of Sardinia, with a total volume of about 18,000 tons, but 90% of these fish were eaten by the Italians. The Kingdom of Sardinia is slightly weaker than the Austrian Empire, with an annual catch of about 16,000 tons. France's catch of about 40,000 tons, and the British Empire's catch of about 100,000 tons in later generations. The freshwater fish production of a certain eastern country was 32 million tons, so Franz's freshwater fish breeding plan is still very promising. Back to business. The hungry Hugo lit the third match, and a figure that seemed familiar yet unfamiliar appeared in front of him. Adele? Hugo felt like he was hallucinating. After patting his forehead, he realized that the person in front of him was Miss Tina, Adele Hugo, the youngest daughter of Victor Hugo. Mr. Hugo, I can't find you in the hotel. The hotel owner said you checked out. What are you doing here? Tina asked with concern. In fact, she had known Hugo's movements for a long time. After all, Franz couldn't really let a generation of writers freeze to death in Vienna. I made you laugh, Miss Tina. I didn't have money to pay the rent, and I didn't want to be kicked out, so I left by myself. Hugo said slightly apologetically. Mr. Hugo, I told you to do what you can. I just think you should succeed. Hugo said very sincerely. But you are not the son after all. You can't just give without taking anything. That's what you said. Hugo smiled miserably, but he felt much better and turned to leave. At this time, Tina pulled Hugo's sleeve. Why are you going? I have no idea. Why don't you come and sit at my house? Hugo spent an unforgettable Christmas Eve, but when he woke up again he was already sitting in a first-class carriage heading to Venice. The pocket watch and ring that had been pawned off were all recovered. The suitcase left at the hotel was at my feet. Even my beard was clean shaven. A lot of things seem to have happened in the past few months, but nothing seems to have happened. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 668 Smuggling Trade. Although there were constant frictions between France and the German Confederation, and there were even several tense battles, the French border was still ineffective for the merchants of South Germany. Austrian goods can enter France without any hindrance, and the latter's raw materials can also enter the former country. Paul Stenkel is a Bavarian smuggler who has been walking this route for many years. But it was not until the formation of the German Zollverein that he truly escaped the poverty line. Bavaria at that time was not the heart of Germany as we know it now, but a complete rotten land, also nicknamed Germany's appendix. Yes, it is the kind of thing that is dispensable, but can kill people if it gets sick. As a thoroughly agricultural country, it is bound to lag behind in this era of rapid industrial development. Even more unfortunate is the Wetterbach family that rules Bavaria. Several generations of monarchs have little interest in developing the economy and competing for hegemony. Therefore, the poverty of Bavarians can be said to be the highest in Germany. especially after the establishment of the German customs union. A large amount of Prussian agricultural products crowded out the already precarious Bavarian agriculture point. Although Austria continues to absorb German refugees and provides job opportunities for Germans, but there are still many people who are unwilling to leave the land where they were born. However, when agriculture cannot support themselves, they can only choose smuggling. In fact, they were not the only ones smuggling. The governments of the three South German countries were even involved in smuggling. In the past, French goods were popular, so they could only tolerate the other party lowering the price of their own goods, and at the same time, they tried their best to get the French to bring more goods so that they could earn enough fees to cope with the levels of exploitation. However, after the establishment of the German customs union, the price-performance ratio of Austrian products was much better than that of French smuggled goods. Therefore, the relationship between supply and demand soon became upside down. French goods were no longer popular in the German region, and some French people even began to purchase goods from the German region. This is the first time that German smugglers have taken the initiative in the transaction, and they naturally want to take advantage of it. At this time, Paul Stenkel took out a box of exquisite matches and said, "Sir, this is specially made according to your request. All wooden handles are made of aged maple wood. The aroma when burning will be reminiscent of the romantic streets of Paris, and the burning time can reach 20 seconds. The outer packaging is also marked with the word romantic Paris in French according to your request. Lilac. It seems you Bavarians are very knowledgeable. The liquidum tree is one of Paris' iconic tree species." Several French smugglers on the opposite side repeatedly inspected the appearance, then lit a few matches to check, sniffed a few times through the nose, snorted several times, and finally nodded with satisfaction. In fact, in addition to matches, there are also agricultural machinery and clocks, rubber shoes, pearls, gems and other goods. The goods brought by the French are also diverse, including all kinds of food, drink, and even oars and cotton. This match is naturally made in Austria, because the colorful patterns and text on the outer packaging use printing technology that is not available in France. Even if it is reproduced using similar technology, the cost will be much higher than that of smuggled goods from Austria. Apart from matches, the best-selling product in Austria is sewing machines. Although the French have also imitated them, the situation is similar to that of the British. Although they are assembled from the same parts, French products are prone to breakage, and problems always arise. Therefore, original and genuine products have become the pursuit of wealthy French people. Although these people may not necessarily use such things, they can display their financial resources and status at home. In fact, even musical instruments such as pianos have joined the ranks of smuggled goods. The Baden government even built a railway in order to stimulate the development of the local economy. Border trade. There are also other items that are not very popular in Austria, but are very popular in France, including toothpaste, soap, and cosmetics. France at this time is not that conservative country that has not popularized 3G networks in 2021. On the contrary, the French at this time are very willing to accept new things. Of course, it is also easier to deceive to a certain extent. To deal with romantic French people, just give them a big picture. Things such as toothpaste, soap, and cosmetics can increase their personal charm and make them more attractive. But Franz didn't lie. These personal items can indeed increase appearance and personal charm to a certain extent. It's just that the price is a bit outrageous, but the more expensive it is, the more it appeals to the French upper class. In addition, Franz had high hopes for paper cigarettes, which became popular among France's upper class. However, since the French do not have such a thing as a cigarette rolling machine, not only the output is low, but the price is also expensive, so they cannot compete with the smuggled cigarettes from Austria. But in this era, paper cigarettes were still not mainstream, and people still liked to use pipes and snus in the Austrian Empire. Only the military and dock workers were the audience for paper cigarettes. Especially in Vienna, let alone paper cigarettes. No one even dared to smoke cigarettes in the whole of Austria. Only northern Italy and Hungary have relatively good results in tobacco sales. Due to the nationalism in Bohemia, the spiritual opium has completely eclipsed the status of tobacco. In short, Franz's dream of relying on tobacco taxes to feed Austria was shattered. Although Egypt's Muhammad Ali used tobacco and alcohol to feed his army. According to the experience of later generations, nicotine is ingested slowly and in small amounts through pipes, cigars, snuff, or directly chewing tobacco, so these traditional smoking methods are not easily addictive. Therefore, if you want to increase the number of smokers, you must vigorously develop paper cigarettes so as to increase the income generated by tobacco. In addition, European cigarettes at this time were also associated with revolution to a certain extent, because the Revolutionary Party was a supporter of cigarettes, while royalists usually preferred traditional pipes and snuff. However, Franz really didn't have much interest in the road of rejuvenating the country through addiction, but in this era, tobacco and alcohol were indeed an important source of national income. Therefore, it is necessary to form monopolies in these two industries. Although tobacco can be directly monopolized by issuing administrative orders, it is simply impossible to monopolize the brewing industry in this way. The former is just an emerging field, while the latter involves the interests of too many people. This benefit is even big enough to make some people choose to take risks. At this time, the tobacco industry obviously does not have such energy. Franz did make a name for himself in the beer industry, but Austrians love wine more than beer. The sales volume of Pilsner beer has been doubling in recent years. It must be said that in this era, the profits of this product are frighteningly high. Civilians may not smoke, but almost no one doesn't drink beer. So as long as people in this era have a little money, beer sales will skyrocket. As for wine, there is really nothing he can do. After all, Franz does not want to be the enemy of the entire aristocratic class. Chapter 669. In the East. On Christmas Day in 1845, German immigrants living in the Hungarian region of the Austrian Empire gathered at the royal estate to celebrate this wonderful holiday. After 6 years of development, the estate has truly become established. What was once a wasteland has now become a vast expanse of fertile land. Agricultural towns were also established around the manor. Although there was only a barrier of fences and low walls around the perimeter, no horse bandits dared to attack them anymore. Because the immigrants had spontaneously established militia organizations. Although they are far from a real army, they are enough for some stragglers. In fact, in addition to the Germans who were strangers in a foreign land, there were also some unwelcome Hungarians in the royal estate. Some of them were serfs, some were too poor nobles, and some were people who went against the mainstream thinking. They all have one thing in common, that is, they are victims of the Kingdom of Hungary. Most of these Hungarians have been listed as refugees by the Hungarian government, and they intend to sell them to America. The slave trade in North and South America is very developed. To become white slaves, most of those German immigrants suffered more direct blows, namely several horse bandit rebellions and the massacre of Germans. So at this time, people of two different nationalities seemed extremely warm in the same home. In autumn in this black land, farmland stretches out one after another. Golden waves of wheat dance in the breeze, and ears of rice in the rice fields compete to grow toward the sun. The immigrants worked hard on this land, and their sweat blended with the black soil, creating a harmonious picture. The land in Hungary is really suitable for the development of agriculture. Whether it is wheat, corn, grapes, or sugar beets, they all thrive. To be honest, they all lamented the fertility of this land. They did not expect that the once wasteland could be turned into fertile farmland so easily. Especially the black land under your feet, where everything grows, is simply countless times better than the barren land in North Germany. Of course, these immigrants did not know the term black land. They only thought that their efforts had moved God, or that the Austrian Imperial royal family had given them this fertile land. In short, they will not thank the Hungarian government, let alone pay taxes for it. This is enough for Franz. Although agriculture is the foundation of the country, industry is the tool for rejuvenating the country in this era. So Franz does not expect much income from the country's agriculture. Colonial agriculture naturally had to make money, otherwise how could we maintain it? What is the purpose of developing it? In the cold winter days, everyone begins to prepare for Christmas celebrations. There was no suitable Christmas tree, so they built one out of corn and wheat straw, and decorated it with colored paper. However, Christmas on the Great Plains is extremely wild. People will light Christmas trees and have a bonfire party at night. This is actually a traditional harvest festival originated in Hungary, but since the Germans are the majority, they celebrate Christmas together. The happiest people in the festival are the children, because on this day, they may wear new clothes. At that time, the price of cloth was still relatively expensive, and farmers were relatively frugal. Even if the clothes were torn, they would basically make do with them, as long as they were not torn. But Hungary's royal estates were not as poor as they thought. These small agricultural towns were small and well equipped, ranging from small sugar factories to blacksmith shops that produced tools. Of course, this scale can only maintain the local minimum living standard. If it is alive, it still needs to be imported from the Austrian Empire. France actually had a deeper consideration on this point, because they were too close to the Hungarians. Although France has done a lot, there is no guarantee that nothing unexpected will happen by then. Once these small towns are besieged, although resistance may pay a heavy price, France feels that if they surrender, they may encounter a more miserable ending. Therefore, it is necessary to make these men self-sufficient for a period of time, even if it may have a certain impact on the national market economic layout in the future. France thinks it is worthwhile. In Franz's plan, the self-sufficient industries in these small towns were small and primitive. Once the future railways were connected here, these industries would die out quickly. In theory, they would not have a negative impact on the future economy of the Austrian Empire. The Christmas dinner in the royal manor is much richer than the tables of serfs and ordinary nobles in Hungary. The first is a large number of carp. That's right. Franz never passes up an opportunity to promote his merchandise. An overwhelming amount of carp occupied the tables of the immigrants, followed by a large amount of candy. After all, the Mexicans really had nothing to use to pay off their debts, and Franz also planted a large amount of sugar beets for food security, which directly led to a short-term sugar overproduction. In addition, many cattle, horses, and sheep were raised on the Great Plains. These livestock were the main force in destroying straw, and also provided meat for the immigrants. Although the immigrants are all Catholics, they don't have so many rules. On Christmas, they eat whatever is available, and whatever is delicious. Chicken, duck, cow, horse, rabbit, carp are served together, plus some cheap Pilsner beer and home-brewed wine, to make the most sumptuous Christmas dinner. Besides, how can Austrians leave music? All kinds of messy musical instruments and serfs came into play, and some even knocked on rice bowls and buckets at the same time. Hungarians are also a nation that is good at singing and dancing. They played various national musical instruments and came to help out, and soon everyone became one with each other. Some are mental, some are physical. After all, anything can happen under the influence of alcohol. Of course, this also promotes national integration to a certain extent, but the Hungarians in the royal estate have more outrageous methods. That's right. This group of people claimed that they were East Germans and came from Russia. They had a strong accent, so it was normal for North Germans to not understand them. Although this statement is very outrageous, a group of immigrants from North Germany really have nothing to say, because they often fail to understand each other when communicating with South Germans. Silesia was 6 years old at this time, and the little girl was very busy throughout Christmas, because her father was a self-defense officer in the militia and would not leave his post even on Christmas. The mother, Ephra, is the cook in the manor, and Christmas is her busiest day. The little girl is very sensible. She and her brothers and sisters help deliver the food and ask for some tips from the adults. Although Silesia's family is very busy, they all seem very happy, because although Silesia had never experienced it, she often heard her parents, brothers, and sisters mention how difficult their life was in Prussia. A family would lick a can of milk for a week. Digging wild vegetables everywhere and picking up a pile of cow dung can make you happy for several days. Chapter 670. Some are happy and some are sad. Ace and Rebe are the adopted sons of Archbishop Prussia. Although their elder brother is physically disabled, he has become the mouthpiece, preacher, of the church through hard work. The younger sister Ruby has become a combatant with her extraordinary talent and courage, which is very rare in the entire church. This is their second Christmas in Austria. Although they are sleeping rough, they have a home again. In 1843, for the sake of domestic political security and people's living space, the Dutch government decided to relocate the Catholic German-speaking, Dutch-speaking Population in the Flemish region. The destination is naturally the Austrian Empire. It must be said that the maritime peoples are very enterprising. After receiving Franz's promise, these people became the main force of Austria's foreign colonization. In contrast, Italians are much more willing to work as porters at the docks and do odd jobs in the fields, but Franz couldn't let this group of guys gather in the same place all the time. There were too many Italians, and they had to be broken up to better integrate into the country. The Austrian imperial government began to encourage Italians to go out. In addition to those who were self-employed, some government projects also tried to use Italians as much as possible. The most important of these is the construction of railways. Due to the complex terrain of the Austrian Empire, the number of laborers and technical requirements required to build railways are much higher than those of other countries. Fortunately, in this era, the Austrian Empire had a large number of talented engineers. They completed many tasks that were considered impossible at the time, and also created miracles that amazed later generations. For example, the Semmering Railway, known as the greatest civil engineering project in European history and a miracle in the history of railway construction. Zell Railway, one of the most dangerous railways in Europe. Arlberg Railway, the highest railway in Europe at the time. Tauhusband Mountain Railway, Zilla Gorge Railway. Franz didn't know much about engineering, and all he could provide was high quality cement and materials, and enough manpower at the same time. He can guarantee one thing, that is, the salary of all engineers will not be reduced, and their names will be remembered in history. Under the heavy rewards, railway engineering in the Austrian Empire once became a prominent science. Another result is that after 12 years of hard work, the railway length of the Austrian Empire has increased from 30 kilometers to 6,300 kilometers today. 600 kilometers during the same period in history. At this time, the Austrian Empire temporarily became the country with the longest railway mileage in the world, but it would soon be surpassed by Britain and the United States. At this time, the United States had 4,500 kilometers of railways, but over the next 5 years, the number would increase rapidly, at an average rate of 2,000 kilometers per year, eventually reaching 14,000 kilometers in 1850. At this time Britain had 5,200 kilometers of railways, but this would reach 12,000 kilometers in 1848. Historically, the length of railways in the German region was 3,200 kilometers, but at this time, due to the stimulation of the Austrian Empire, the total mileage had reached 4,500 kilometers. In France, the distance has been increased from 1,400 kilometers to 1,800 kilometers, although the Louis-Philippe government announced a 10,000 kilometer railway construction plan not long ago. There is still a question mark as to how much of this plan will be put into action. According to Franz's plan, the total mileage of the Austrian Empire's railways would reach 7,500 kilometers by 1848. In this way, the main cities and fortresses in the Lusitania region are all connected. If necessary, a large number of troops can be assembled at key nodes in a short period of time, at least enough for defense and counterinsurgency closer to home. In addition to things like building railways and dams, Franz's other plan is overseas immigration. Austria's overseas colonies can actually absorb a considerable number of immigrants, but the Italians are really too salty. Even when these guys arrived in Africa, dozens of people would often gather together in the scorching sun to watch ants fight. In fact, white people are a race that is very prone to sunburn, so it was extremely difficult to colonize Africa. But these Italians would rather be lazy at the risk of getting sunburned than do more meaningful things. It can only be said that the salted fish is home. In the Salzburg military camp, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson reunited again. The last time they met was during the Mexican-American War at Zachary Taylor's Camp Rio Grande. It's just that victory came in a bit of a panic. The US military was repeatedly beaten by the Mexican army and finally won the victory under the power of the French. That's not a good memory. When an international student from the United States mentioned the Mexican-American War, Robert E. Lee sighed with emotion. It was a disaster caused by a stupid pig. Mexico was like a bandit on the prairie, and the Union soldiers behaved like a flock of frightened lambs. Stonewall Jackson was much more straightforward. He was very dissatisfied with Zachary Taylor's command, because the latter perfectly explains what it means. To have one general incompetent and exhaust the three armies. Richard Ewell, a famous Southern general, was 29 years old at this time. He participated in a more brutal battle, Stephen Kearny's expedition point, whether it was the adventure through Death Canyon, the Night of Terror, or the storming of the San Gabriel Fortress. Richard Ewell participated in it all. Point therefore, he was demoted from an army captain to a second lieutenant. 1/3 of his men died on the road. During the Night of Terror, Richard Ewell was the first to discover the Austrian surprise attack force. Point however, the sentry on duty that night refused Richard Ewell's request on the grounds that the general had fallen asleep. Point after that, he tried to find several other senior officers, but in the end he didn't even have a chance to speak. In the end, he could only watch tens of thousands of troops killing each other. In fact, there is more than one stupid pig, and those politicians and intelligence officers should also be thrown into the septic tank. The Austrian army is far stronger than they say. Point fortunately, what we encountered at that time was only a miscellaneous force composed of militiamen and mercenaries. If it was really the main Austrian force stationed here in Salzburg, the expeditionary force heading to California would definitely be wiped out. Richard Ewell's words resonated immediately as soon as he spoke them. Everyone who participated in the California Expeditionary Force still remembers that brutal battle. Point. If the Battle of the Rio Grande was a sit-in and a shame, then the Battle of California was a nightmare and a lingering shadow for these people. Point. In addition, there are some battles that American students are unwilling to mention, and that is the Battle of Veracruz. The Battle of the Rio Grande was well timed when faced with the yellow fever epidemic. The Battle of California was well positioned when faced with the unconquerable Fort San Gabriel. And the Battle of Veracruz was entirely due to Winfield Scott's arrogance. Point. In that battle, the US military had a bad start, but missed opportunities again and again, and in the end, could only rely on the opponent's mistakes to survive. Point. These American students in Austria became more and more frustrated as they talked. They felt even more desperate when they saw the powerful Austrian Imperial army outside. In the end, they could only drink to relieve their sorrow. Chapter 671. Some are happy and some are sad. In fact, a considerable number of American students studying abroad still want to return to the United States to carry out military reforms, because they see the gap, and feel that the US military must change to keep up with the trend of the times. However, what these people don't know is that most of their official careers have been terminated, and even if they return to the US Army, it will be difficult for them to be reused. Point. This was of course not only because of Franz's obstruction and James Polk's suspicion, but also because the US Army at this time was a place where seniority was hard to come by. Point. In short, if you want to get ahead, you must first have seniority. If this group of people study abroad, it will obviously result in a serious lack of seniority, and naturally they will not be able to be high-ranking officials. In fact, in addition to this group of American students, Belid and Ulrich Salis, two international students from the Swiss Orthodox Union, are also very worried. The longer they stay in Austria, the more they feel that their country's military is embarrassing and useless. In fact, the Austrian Empire's military gave similar evaluations. They felt that these foreign students were embarrassing and did not think that these people had the potential to become excellent commanders. But what these arrogant old Austrian professors don't know is that the Austrian Empire will fall into a general shortage in the future. Point. Historically, after the veteran generals of the Austrian Empire retired during the Napoleonic era, military talents quickly withered. In the later stages, only some military band officers could be used as generals. This kind of behavior of rushing ducks to the shelves will naturally only encounter one big defeat after another in Franz's plan. If these people are really unusable, they can be sent back to the United States, which can at least help the Southern Army last for a while. Point. In fact, most of the American students Franz recruited were generals of the Southern Army, so this can be regarded as a double insurance. Even if the Austrian Empire cannot use it, it can still be put back to disgust the American Northern Army. Point. Some people are happy, while others are worried. On the island of Great Britain at this time. Point. In Whitehall, Robert Peel's hair was turning grey. Letters of help from India and the rhetoric used by all parties to shirk responsibility. Point. In fact, Britain is still facing many challenges at this time. Russia is an old rival in the fight for world hegemony. I won't go into detail here. The main reason is that I will talk about it often in the future. Moreover, Russia is in the swamp of the Chechen War at this time. The two are inseparable point, but the most immediate problem is hegemony in the Near East. The Russians have always been eyeing the Ottoman Empire, and the British cannot let the polar bears go to sea. In addition, Britain's colonial hegemony has also been challenged. At this time, France is expanding crazily in the Americas and Asia, supporting its own power everywhere, and has a tendency to regain hegemony in North America. France is the country that has the most direct conflicts with Britain in its colonies, including fictitious conflicts in Central America, West Africa, and Oceania. Then to the tense situation in the Viceroyalty of La Plata and the crazy expansion in North America. They even directly bought the Serampore colony in the British Indian colony, plundered Vietnam, got involved in Far Eastern affairs, and also took on Spanish colonial affairs. Facing this old opponent, Robert Peel already has a headache. If France successfully unites Spain in the future, the French Empire will come back to earth. By that time, Britain will face greater challenges, but in the final analysis, the reason why the French can come back has to be blamed on the French themselves. After all, the Treaty of Vienna had almost bound France, but in order to weaken the influence of the Holy Alliance, Britain acquiesced to France's expansion, and at the same time attacked Austria's power. The result is that France is now ungovernable, and the Austrian Empire is frantically consolidating its influence within its own circles. At this time, the French were frantically building warships in an attempt to restore the glory of their colonial empire. For the foreseeable future, Britain and France would engage in colonial competition around the world. This refers to vassal and enslaved kingdoms, or horse racing and enclosure, but in this era the great powers still did not have the ability to penetrate deep into the interior. What annoyed Robert Peel the most was that Britain's economic hegemony was also being challenged, but it was more about technological hegemony than economic hegemony. Due to technological advancement, the Austrian Empire had led the UK in some fields, and began to export goods to the UK in reverse. This made the British economy even worse. Although it was known as the world's factory and the most powerful country at this time, its industrial capacity was somewhat excessive compared to its market. Economic crisis. Yes, it is an economic crisis. In British history, an economic crisis has erupted almost every 10 years. In fact, this is mainly due to the liberalism pursued by the United Kingdom, which often leads to excessive concentration of capital. This not only causes a waste of resources, but also greatly increases the risk of financial crisis. The result is that profits for some goods and industries in the UK skyrocket or plummet in a short period of time, causing economic turmoil for the entire country. Secondly, the UK's own market is limited, and it relies heavily on external markets. France has actually always avoided direct conflict with Britain, but in the latter's eyes, the former is already a major threat. The British capitalists have demanded punishment of the Austrian Empire, and the easiest way to deal with it is to block the Adriatic Sea. This is not difficult for the British Navy to do, but now the front they are fighting is too long, and wars and major events around the world are dragging their energy. Especially the war between Uruguay and Brazil in South America. If Britain can take the opportunity to control Brazil, it can turn South America into its own backyard. By then, Britain will be able to recreate an India from the Western Hemisphere, and 2 Indias will be enough to make the British Empire reach the top of the world. At the same time, it will truly make up for the regret of losing the North American colonies, whether it is sending troops to southern Albania, or giving up the Pacific Ocean port to the United States. It is all intended to weaken Austria's overseas competitiveness. However, the above 2 attempts obviously failed. Instead of having any effect, they plunged themselves into the quagmire of Albania, and at the same time, gave the United States a chance to survive. At this time, British capitalists asked Robert Peel to adopt a more direct and effective way to protect their interests. The Prime Minister naturally knows what that means, but at this time India is in danger, and these people are still blaming each other and fighting for power. Now Robert Peel doesn't want to care about those idiots who can only see immediate benefits, nor does he want to care about anything else. He just wants to preserve Britain's foundation in the South Asian subcontinent. As a result, Robert Peel issued 12 orders, ordering all troops and regions that could support India to defend the brightest pearl of the British Empire at all costs in this era. In this world, only the British could project more than 200,000 troops from the sea in a short term. Relatively, Robert Peel's actions may seem crazy, but they actually have a reason. At this time, India was almost in the hands of the United Kingdom. Its contribution to the United Kingdom was not only raw materials, but also a relatively broad market point at the same time. The Indian subcontinent is also the springboard for Britain to explore the Far East. It is no exaggeration to say that, if India is lost, Britain will sooner or later become a second-rate country. In order not to bet on Britain's future, Robert Peel had no choice but to bet on himself. With Britain's national strength at this time, India can definitely be saved. But the war in South America, the policy of blocking Russia, the plan to weaken Austria, and the deployment of slowing down the pace of French colonization may all have to give way to the war to defend India. And it is still unclear what impact these 6 months of back and forth will have on the future of the world. Chapter 672 Punch on Cotton. Robert Peel, who risked his own reputation and career in order not to risk the future of his country, is truly admirable. He lived up to his reputation as the chief architect of the Victorian era and Britain's first public servant. Franz preferred to be called a statesman rather than a politician. It's just that this great politician's all-staking blow was actually of little use, because the uprising that was raging on the Indian subcontinent disappeared without a trace almost overnight. All this stems from the internal conflict between the Kingdom of Afghanistan and the Sikh Empire. Akbar Khan is considered a very wise king. He is willing to settle the differences with the Sikh Empire and even make concessions, giving up part of the disputed territory between the two parties, with the Sikh Empire form an alliance to resist the British army. However, Queen Jinder, the de facto ruler of the Sikh Empire at this time, did not trust Akbar Khan. The former turned a deaf ear to the latter's request for supplies, neither agreed nor rejected his proposed joint operations, and even offered him provide false information. Queen Jinder is a shrewd woman. She hopes to sit on the mountain and watch the tiger fight. When both sides were severely weakened, she started picking peaches again, replicating her miracle in the court struggle. It doesn't matter if the Afghans lose. Anyway, the Indian subcontinent is in chaos now. As long as the Sikh Empire proposes a ceasefire, the British should be very happy to accept it. The Sikh Empire, which was recharging its strength, could take the opportunity to annex the Kingdom of Afghanistan, and then go south to invade India and catch the British by surprise. But Akbar Khan was not a fool. His father was an old cunt, and he knew this trick very well. Akbar Khan endured the humiliation before, because he wanted to deal with the British, the big enemy, first. But when he met a pig teammate, he knew that nothing could be done. As a result, the Afghan army quietly retreated. At this time, Henry Harding was a little confused. He had clearly been attacked from both sides before, but why suddenly there were no enemies on the battlefield? However, as a veteran, he knew that when something goes wrong, there must be a monster, and now is definitely not a good time to pursue. A hasty attack will only give the opponent an opportunity. Although the Indian subcontinent is turbulent at this time, judging from the battle in Nepal, except for the Sikh Empire and the Kingdom of Afghanistan, there is nothing to worry about. It's just that the combination of the Sikh Empire and the Kingdom of Afghanistan is really difficult to deal with, because no matter which side attacks, the other side can take the opportunity to launch a sneak attack on the British occupied areas. Two major enemies have occupied difficult terrain, and the Indian colonies are all plains and cannot be defended. Therefore, for the sake of safety, Henry Harding wanted to spend 2 to 3 years building a perimeter around the Sikh Empire, surround him to death. But now the encirclement network has not been completed, and the Afghans are coming from another direction. Plus there are numerous rebels behind them. Therefore, Henry Harding could only ask London for help, and then wait for help. At least he could not lose control of the Indian subcontinent. This was his bottom line. However, Henry Harding never expected that after the Afghans withdrew their troops, they carried out intense burning, killing, and looting in the Kalat Khanate for a period of time, and then withdrew their troops before leaving. Akbar Khan also burned down the plank road in the mountains, completely cutting off the possibility of another invasion in the short term, and by the way cheating the Sikh Empire. At the same time, internal strife broke out again within the Sikh Empire. Queen Kaina and her lover planned a wave of purges in the royal capital, but things were revealed. As a result, 1/3 of the royal capital was burned down, and nearly 10,000 soldiers and officers died in the internal fighting. After repeatedly confirming the authenticity of the incident, Henry Harding invaded the Sikh Empire. This time, it was overwhelming, and it took less than a month to invade the Sikh Maharaja. At this time, Queen Jinder still wanted to negotiate, but Henry Harding sent her and the last emperor of the Sikh Empire directly to Delhi. The Sikh Empire also had to give up its claims, be reduced to a kingdom, be managed by the British East India Company, and fully implement the colonial Letwal system. The Letwal system was a land taxation system implemented by the British colonial authorities in India. Leta is the Hindi name for farmers. At the beginning of the 19th century, the British colonial authorities in Bombay and Madras directly levied land tax from farmers, which accounted for 1/3 to 1/2 of the harvest. In the later period, it even reached 2/3 of the land harvest. In fact, this is a means of land annexation, and it is also one of the important reasons for the slow, relatively, population growth in the Indian subcontinent. After the news of the British capture of Gujranwala, the Sikh capital, came only a few months later. The rebellion in those Indian princely states disappeared. That's right. They disappeared because the princes of the feudal states did not admit that they had participated in the rebellion at all. They were just doing it for self-defense. However, the British, who came from all directions, were still landing on the Indian subcontinent. They did not come to watch a show. They came to fight and make money. But how can we make money without fighting? So the war on the Indian subcontinent resumed, especially in coastal areas and wealthy cities. India's wealthy businessmen have also been intimately protected by the red shirts, but no matter what, Britain always kept India, the brightest pearl in the crown of the British Empire. However, the lack of power in Europe forced the British government's foreign policy and attitude to change. This was a heavy blow to Viscount Stratford, who had always advocated weakening the Austrian Empire. After all, in the eyes of Stratford Canning, only a weak Austria was in the best interest of Britain. If we look at it from God's perspective, Stratford Canning's view is simply ridiculous. Historically, Russia, France, the United States and the New World, the Qing dynasty in the Far East, and Prussia, which had not yet risen, seemed to be more threatening than the Austrian Empire, a doll that could be broken at the first prick. But in Canning's eyes, it was a different story. The Austrian Empire was born out of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Habsburg family united Spain to create the world's first colonial empire. Metternich dominated the Vienna system, and he also killed his beloved brother, George Canning. Metternich asked Russia, Prussia, and Austria to form the Holy Alliance, which was a challenge to Britain. France was trapped in the Vienna system, unable to threaten British hegemony, and even risked being invaded by Austria. But in fact, the Vienna system is not very restrictive to France at all, and the European part has not been weakened in any way. The French have been planning to annex the Rhineland region of Germany, and are always ready to invade northern Italy again. Russia is an uncivilized country. Their civilization is not worth mentioning, especially in terms of culture. They are just like barbarians. Russians only drink Borst. British people only deserve to look up at the stars. In fact, Russia is the European military police, with a standing army of 600,000 in the Near East, a land area spanning the Eurasian continent, and a population of 75 million that is almost equal to the sum of the three countries of Britain, France, and Prussia. It was under the guidance of this bizarre view, coupled with the emergence of France, that the British Empire fell into an unprecedented diplomatic crisis. Chapter 673. At this time, because the riots in the Indian subcontinent involved too much British power, Robert Peel had to begin to re-examine his foreign policy. It didn't matter. He found that the foreign ministers under him were all useless. Palmerston, the king of understanding who causes fights everywhere, is better than these crooked melons and jujubes. The foreign policy towards the Austrian Empire seemed somewhat inappropriate. In comparison, Russia and France seemed to pose a much greater threat to Britain. In fact, there is another name for this era, that is, the Great Game Era, also known as the British-Russian Great Game Era, which shows the great threat Russia posed to the United Kingdom at that time. Another background is the rise of France. Due to Franz's manipulation, deliberate guidance and a series of accidents, France at this time is far stronger than the recovering France in history. Looking at Austria, any leader with a little political and military knowledge knows how awkward its geographical location as the center of Europe is indeed true in a certain sense, but it can also be considered the center of the encirclement network. This place of 4 battles could be attacked by a group of people at any time. Except for Britain, whoever wanted to dominate would have to beat Austria. But now it is Britain that has been really confronting the Austrian Empire. The former made many concessions before, but some people in the latter are still dissatisfied. As a result, the Austrian side turned from retreat to confrontation and began to compete with Britain in various fields. Although the scale of this conflict was very limited, the blow was amplified countless times when Britain was at odds with Russia, France, and the United States. Especially when the Austrian Empire extended its hand to the Near East, Britain immediately took countermeasures, sending troops to the Strait of Otranto. As long as the Adriatic Sea is blocked, the overseas trade of the Austrian Empire can be completely interrupted. But can it really be done? As for Britain's foreign relations at this time, except for Sweden and Prussia, which remained neutral towards the former, most of the other powers were hostile to Britain. 5 of the 7 major powers, Russia, France, Austria, the United States, and Spain, were at war with the United Kingdom. Among the other secondary powers, the Netherlands, Egypt, and Denmark were at war with the United Kingdom, while Brazil and the Sikh Empire were at war with the United Kingdom. Robert Peel couldn't help but sigh with emotion. What have the idiot pigs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs been doing all these years? Home Secretary James Graham added another layer of fuel to the fire. Your Majesty Prime Minister, in fact, I have just received some reliable intelligence recently indicating that the Foreign Secretary, the Earl of Aberdeen, has been accepting bribes from other countries. In fact, accepting bribes was very common at that time, but Robert Peel, who was in anger, could not control that much. He directly put all the blame on the hapless foreign minister. When the foreign minister was dismissed, the happiest person was the deputy minister. Stratford Canning was excited at the thought that he could continue his strategy against Austria after taking office. That's right, he planned to launch a direct attack on Austria's colonies, cut off its overseas trade channels, plan several riots in the country, and deprive the Austrian Empire of the leadership of the German Confederation. However, Viscount Stratford's impassioned speech did not impress Prime Minister Robert Peel. On the contrary, he was dismissed by the latter as deputy minister and assigned to the Ottoman Empire. Countering him is Palmerston, a king who has always advocated tough foreign policy. However, King is very flexible in his stance and knows how to assess the situation. Palmerston did not think that it was wise to confront the prime minister at this time. At the same time, he did not think that the anti-Austrian policy that had been continued since the old Canning period had any value. Most of Austria's overseas interests have little conflict with Britain, and Tranquilla in India is just a small area, and it is far away from the core area of Indian rule, and it cannot hinder British plans at all. As for the vicious competition in the Near East, as a former ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, he knew the ins and outs of these things. However, it was due to the greed of some British businessmen who broke the rules first, and some excessive actions by the British government, that the Austrian Empire fought back. Palmerston felt that these were trivial matters in the face of British hegemony. With the rise of France and Russia's struggle for hegemony, it seemed inappropriate to continue to suppress Austria. Palmerston's thinking was very clear. He felt that, if Britain wanted to continue to maintain its hegemony, it should divide the Holy Alliance and then win over France and Austria to fight against Russia. At the same time, create conflicts between France and Austria, and then support the United States and North America to create more conflicts, and strengthen ties with the Kingdom of Prussia and the Kingdom of Sardinia. Only keeping the Italian region and the North German region in a loose state is most suitable. British interests support Austria's eastward expansion, especially by taking advantage of the special relationship between the two Danube principalities and Russia, to force Russia and Austria to turn against each other. As for the Ottomans, they are really unable to hold up the wall. If they can be combined with Prussia, they may be able to fight against Russia, but that is simply impossible. The Ottomans and Persians regarded each other as heretics, and had a long history of ethnic hatred. Palmerston felt that at this time, the best strategy should be to repair the relationship with the Austrian Empire and France first, and let them turn their guns towards Russia. Because Russia in this generation did not sign the Straits Convention. The Russians still nominally have control of the Black Sea Strait, the Winkarai-Scalisi Treaty. Therefore, when Russia strives for hegemony in the future, it may have to pass through Austria's territory, so it is very important to have a good relationship with it. At the same time, in the east, the Austrians opened the door to Japan, but did not allow it to trade with other powers. This kind of behavior of eating alone is despising. Britain can definitely enter Japan as an ally of Austria and then seize the market. After all, in the eyes of no king, Austria's industrial and agricultural development level is far inferior to that of Britain. Coupled with the fact that Britain is relatively close to Japan, Britain can easily capture the market captured by the Austrians. Austria and France have many overlapping colonies, so it is very easy to provoke disputes between the two countries, whether in Central America, West Africa, North America, or Asia. Overseas operations require a large number of soldiers and materials. Only Britain in the world has enough ships and strength to send these things where they want to go, so if they want to gain an advantage in the competition, they must have a good relationship with the British Empire. By that time, Britain will be able to completely change its passive diplomatic situation, and even profit from it by provoking a war. This is the path that is most suitable for Britain. Palmerston's theory was very much in line with Robert Peel's wishes, who felt that it would be too much of a loss for Britain to end the war in person, and that it would be better to let the great powers fight each other. The objective reality is that at this time, the British military forces are too scattered, and the institutions are too bloated, making it difficult to form unified mobilization. In fact, Palmerston has a very vicious vision. The strategies he gives in the book are very consistent with the character's character, and are also in line with the British diplomatic style at this time. Of course, they are certainly more complete and more reasonable than the British diplomatic strategies in history. The characters and countries in the book have been strengthened to a certain extent, and the historical strategies may not always be continued. So please, don't take your seat on some things. Chapter 674 The Goodwill of the British. January 1st, 1846. Vienna, Hofburg Palace. Prince Metternich looked extremely excited after seeing off the British envoy, as if he had returned to decades ago. Metternich was a little worried when he learned that the British Foreign Secretary had just been replaced by Palmerston, but the former sent a special envoy to express goodwill to the Austrian Empire as soon as he took office, which greatly moved the latter. However, this so-called goodwill was too dry in Franz's eyes. The British wedge in Albania was not removed, and the Mediterranean fleet even expanded. Others, such as the withdrawal of troops from southern Brazil, were entirely the result of the rebellion on the Indian subcontinent that caused the British forces to be dispersed and had to consider a comprehensive contraction. Then came the formal British recognition of the Austrian Empire's occupation of Western Bosnia and Montenegro. That's right. It is a mere recognition of the occupation, and what is even more egregious is that this does not include Belgrade. In fact, from 1839 to today, after Franz's manual selection, the West Bosnians no longer regard themselves as subjects of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, the brainwashed Western Bosnians felt that they were never Ottomans, but Austrian subjects trapped in the Ottoman Empire. Moreover, Western Bosnia and Belgrade were both connected to the Great Illyrian Line in 1845. Now even if some people are inspired to rebel, the Austrian army can arrive within a day to suppress it. Therefore, the British's admission was completely indifferent, and then they wrote about it in the newspapers, and gave it to Metternich as a meeting gift. In addition, if the troops are not withdrawn from southern Brazil, I'm afraid that there will also be problems in Uruguay and the Viceroyalty of La Plata. After all, both Rosas and La Higuera who was supported by the British, were typical virtuous kings and benevolent masters point under their governance. Public dissatisfaction was already boiling, and coupled with the continuous wars, a large number of people died. If the fight continues, I'm afraid it will turn into a mess. The reason why the British three-nation alliance suffered such huge losses was partly due to the Brazilian resistance and Umbrella's mercenaries, but the more important reason was the harsh local climate. Southern Brazil today is not considered a dangerous place, but at that time it was home to uncivilized forests, rivers, swamps, mountains, poisonous insects, ferocious beasts, and various tropical diseases. More than 80% of the casualties among soldiers on both sides were caused by the natural environment, and a considerable number of the remaining people died from the law of the dark forest. Whether it is within the three-nation coalition, between the Brazilian militia and government forces, or the employees of Umbrella Company, they are all used to this kind of melee. This kind of war of attrition is simply a disaster for a powerful country. If such casualties were recorded in later generations, Robert Peel's cabinet would have collapsed long ago. However, the so-called human rights in this era are still just words, not to mention that the control of information at this time is in the hands of the government. People can only know what Robert Peel wants them to know. As for the casualty figures of this special military operation, only the top brass can know. But no matter what, at this time when the war in India is tense, it is not wise to waste troops in the jungles and swamps of southern Brazil. This is not good news for the Austrian Empire. After all, if the war continues, it will not only weaken Britain, but France can also make some extra money, and by the way, he can cultivate a group of soldiers who are skilled in guerrilla warfare. Pedro II was also very dissatisfied with Britain's approach. After all, it would fight if it said it would fight, and it would embargo if it said it would impose an embargo. Now that he doesn't want to fight, he wants to be friends again, and wants most favored nation treatment. But dissatisfaction was dissatisfaction. At this time, the Brazilian Empire was not qualified to negotiate with the British at all, so it almost fully accepted the latter's requirements. In the end, Pedro II had to take a photo with the British ambassador with great reluctance. As an avid photographer, this photo was the only work that was torn up by him. Historically, Pedro II loved photography very much and collected 21,742 photos in his lifetime. He was the largest photography art collector in South America at that time. In 1839, the French invented the first camera. In 1840, the French ambassador brought a daguerreotype camera, and Pedro II, who was only 14 years old at the time, fell in love with this new technology. Then he spent a lot of money to buy a complete set of equipment and became the first monarch in the world to use a camera. After that, those Brazilian officials followed suit and searched for photographic equipment and experts from all over the world for Pedro I. Until France gave Pedro II a camera modified by the Austrian Empire. The latter threw away all the garbage he had collected. After all, the difference between French products and Austrian products is huge. Even a fool can see the difference, let alone a senior photography fan like Pedro I. This is also an important reason why Pedro II fell to the Austrian Empire. After all, hobbies can affect a person's judgment to a considerable extent. At the same time, it is also a foil for their peers. After all, Britain and France are quite immoral in terms of being immoral. Not only do they run out of tricks in the trade between the two sides, but they also cultivate forces close to them. Although it may not necessarily replace him, he must have thought about turning Brazil into his puppet. However, both Pedro II and the Brazilian Empire had a dream of becoming a great power. This dream of becoming a great nation still affects Brazilians to this day. Brazil has a vast territory, the largest population in South America, rich resources, and no enemies around it. No matter how he looked at it, Pedro II would never be willing to be a puppet, so what Britain and France did made him very disgusted. But because of his limited strength, he can only choose to be vain and conciliatory. When Austria, a country that obviously had no intentions towards Brazil, and could not have any intentions, appeared, Pedro II immediately changed his stance. Brazil needs markets to convert resources into wealth, thereby promoting domestic industrialization reforms, and successfully becoming one of the world's great powers. At first, France was also moved by this rhetoric. He wanted to see the future of the Brazilian Empire. After all, the Austrian and Brazilian empires are far apart, and the biggest headache for the rise of the latter is Britain and the United States. However, people are not as good as God. Brazilians not only like to fight among themselves, but also like fighting among themselves. The continuous wars, coupled with bureaucratic corruption and resistance from local forces, have led to extremely slow progress in industrialization. France, the conscience of heaven and earth, has never sold the monkey version of the equipment to the Brazilian Empire. Although the update speed is not as fast as that of continental Europe, the materials and craftsmanship used are absolutely no different from those in his country. Unfortunately, when these machines arrived in Brazil, they were just like people who were not acclimated to the local environment. The machines often had problems for no apparent reason, and parts even disappeared out of thin air. The parts produced in Brazil cannot match the size or strength of the Austrian machines. The result is repeated explosion on the spot. That's right. Steam engines will explode. I had a heat stroke yesterday, and my mind may not be very clear now. Book friends can help me read it if I find mistakes or things that don't make sense. Chapter 675, The Goodwill of the British. However, the goodwill of the British was not completely useless. In the eyes of Miloš Obrenović, it was like the sky was falling, and the earth was falling. He knew that he would never be able to counterattack Western Bosnia again in his life. As for Belgrade, Miloš Obrenović didn't even dare to think about it. After all, after so many years of repairs and transformations, this former capital of the Grand Duchy of Serbia had completely turned into a fortress. Moreover, both local industry and agriculture were dependent on the market of the Austrian Empire. The entire Belgrade area was not allowed to grow any food crops, but they could enjoy cheap food from the Austrian Empire. Taking into account the population of the Belgrade area and Serbia's weak agriculture. At this time, France had reason to believe that, even if Belgrade returned to Serbian hands, the latter would not be able to support the former. I could have endured the darkness if I had never seen the light. Metamorphosis. Yes, Serbians who have been poor for hundreds of years can endure high intensity work every day, while eating only some foods that are disgusting to livestock. But after they ate bread, butter, carp, and all kinds of strange animals raised by France, these people never wanted to go back to the days of warlord rule and human beings. The bread here refers to non-whole wheat bread, and the price is about a quarter of normal whole wheat bread, but it was pretty good for civilians in this period. The situation in West Bosnia is actually similar. Coupled with the nationalism of the Croatians, it is actually more difficult for Serbia to recover than Belgrade at this time. However, due to the mountainous terrain, Miloš Obrenović in East Bosnia did not have detailed local information. The Montenegrins had no sense of recognition from the British. The British also tried to win over some local families in Montenegro to oppose the rule of the Austrian Empire. But either the British who came to work as lobbyists disappeared, or the families who tried to oppose Austria disappeared. In short, Montenegro was still in the hands of Austria, and it never caused any waves. In fact, Montenegrins and Croatians are very similar. They like to be mercenaries, and have no objection to leaving their hometowns. Therefore, the small Montenegro actually produced 20,000 mercenaries. A reason why Montenegrins like to be mercenaries so much is because their land is too barren. However, with the large number of prime-age men leaving, trying to organize anti-Austrian military operations in Montenegro is like a joke. Not to mention that those responsible for garrisoning the Montenegro region are the Austrian Empire's best troops in mountain warfare, the Iralian Chasseur Regiment and the Croatian Mountain Force. Human beings all have the mentality of admiring the strong. And this is especially obvious among the mountain peoples. Whether they are Gurkhas or black people, they all worship the strong. Therefore, after several battles, the locals completely fell to the side of the Austrian Empire, and they would even take the initiative to suppress the rebels, to show their loyalty. In fact, this situation was not uncommon in the Austrian Empire, but Franz still gave certain rewards in order to strengthen positive feedback and create a model. Although the reward is not high, it is still a considerable amount of income for these Montenegrins. If we look at local taxes, Montenegro at this time was the poorest place in the entire Austrian Empire. The most valuable thing in Montenegro to the Austrian Empire at this time is its people. After all, it is not easy to find people who are willing to leave their hometown and stay abroad for many years. Franz does not have to worry about the overpopulation of Montenegrins, whose population base is much smaller than that of Italians, and relatively speaking, they admire Austrian culture, which means that it is easier to assimilate. At the same time, they don't like to cling to groups, and it is not easy to form independent communities. Of course, the most thorough way to deal with the Montenegro area is to build roads, but given the local terrain and economic conditions, this matter cannot be rushed. It is already being built, but the construction speed is not fast. Despite this innocuous admission and declaration, Palmerston dug a huge hole for the Austrian Empire. That is Madagascar, and what people think of when talking about this place is the animal paradise, Penguins of Madagascar. Movie, Penguins of Madagascar. But Madagascar in the 19th century was one of the few non-European countries that dared to say no to the great powers. The British and the French once studied how to carve up this island country in southeastern Africa. The result of the study at that time was that the west belonged to Britain and the east belonged to France. Because there are more ports in the west and minerals in the east. Everything went very smoothly at first. The Kingdom of Madagascar signed countless contracts with the great powers, and even followed the British advice to stop the slave trade with the Portuguese. However, just when Britain and France thought they were about to succeed, the African female Nero appeared. Rana Voronoi was originally one of the king's 12 wives, but like Wu Zetian, she used iron-fist policies and bloody massacres to take over the country in a short time. After Rana Voronoi came to the throne, she announced that everyone in the country must shave their heads in mourning for her husband. Within a year, no one is allowed to take a bath, dance, sing, sleep in bed or clap hands. Otherwise men will be sentenced to death and women will be treated as public slaves. Westerners at that time only regarded this as an eccentricity of the monarchs of primitive countries, and did not regard it as a dangerous signal. Lana Voronoi is a cold-blooded animal lover who also likes to use animals to execute people. What excites her the most is throwing people to crocodiles and monitor lizards, and watching the victims bite and devour them. In a country with a population of only 2.5 million, Rana Voronoi executed at least 300,000 people in this way. Rana Voronoi to judge whether a person is loyal to his own standards is to throw it to the crocodile. If the crocodile bites him, he is a traitor. If the crocodile does not bite him, he is a wizard. Lana Voronoi hated black people and almost exterminated the black people on the island. After that, Lana Voronoi began to crazily trample on the treaties that the Kingdom of Madagascar had signed. How could this behavior be accepted by the Western civilized powers that uphold the spirit of contract? So Britain and France both sent people to negotiate with the Kingdom of Madagascar, but Lana Voronoi responded by massacring all Christians on the island. And instead of just killing her own people like the Japanese, she also killed Western missionaries and businessmen related to the church. Britain and France were dumbfounded. Even the great dynasties in Asia, let alone Africa, did not dare to do such a thing. So in 1845, the British and French forces bombarded the port of Madoe, hoping to force Rana Voronoi to submit. As a result, the female Nero directly ordered the closure of the port, playing the trick that Kangxi had used to move the border and ban the sea. At this time, Westerners had almost never lost in colonial wars, and naturally they did not know how to be afraid. In the end, about 600 soldiers from the British and French coalition landed on Madagascar, preparing to give these African indigenous people a small Western-style shock. However, what they did not expect was that in the end, the female Nero killed all 600 soldiers of the coalition at the cost of 12,000 lives. This was not over yet. Lana Voronoi also ordered people to insert the heads of all the coalition soldiers on wooden stakes. For a time, the pier of Madoe port was filled with Western heads. I had a heat stroke yesterday, and my mind may not be very clear now. Book friends can help me read it if I find mistakes or things that don't make sense. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.